In the fading light of a world where Rome's eagle standards no longer cast their long shadows across Britain's shores, something extraordinary was quietly beginning. The year was 410 AD, as the last of the Roman legions withdrew from these mist-veiled islands. They left behind more than abandoned roads and crumbling fortresses. They left a silence, and in that silence, something new began to stir, something that would reshape the very soul of this land. What emerged from that chaos would become one of history's most remarkable transformations, a tale of conquest and belief, of kings and peasants, of majestic cathedrals rising from muddy fields, and steel-clad knights riding toward glory or ruin. And tonight, as sleep gently begins to settle upon you, allow me to guide you through the sweeping arc of medieval England, a journey of nearly 1,000 years, told in whispers of ambition, faith, and ceaseless change. This is no mere tale of battles and dates, though we shall encounter both. This is the story of how scattered tribes became a kingdom, how that kingdom braved the fury of Viking sails, how it was conquered by Norman knights, and how it slowly, inexorably, transformed into something the world had never seen before. Our thread will stretch from the smoky timber halls of Saxon warriors to the lofty stone vaults of Gothic cathedrals, from the dim glow of monks copying ancient texts by candlelight to the earth-shaking charge of cavalry at Hastings. We will witness dynasties rising and falling, parliaments being born, poetry blossoming, and the endless tension between crown and church that defined life in the Middle Ages. But before the splendor and structure of the medieval world could emerge, we must pass through the shadows from which it rose. For the Roman departure left Britain fractured, exposed, and longing for leadership. Into this open wound stepped new peoples, whose names still echo in our language, whose shadows still fall upon our landscape. Warriors, Cam descendants, of whom would one day rule an empire upon which the sun never set. The Saxon shore, as the Romans had called it, lay open to the churning gray of the North Sea, and beyond those restless waters, where storm clouds brewed like omens, ambitious tribes gathered for journeys that would alter the course of history. The Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Frisians, pushed by population strain, changing climate, and that timeless hunger for better land, cast their eyes toward the fertile valleys and strong hilltops of post-Roman Britain. What followed was no single invasion, but a long, slow migration, a steady transformation of everything that had been. They came not as one united force, but as many scattered war bands, each following its own lord, each seeking its own piece of the promised land. They brought with them their gods, their laws, their languages, and their dreams of kingdoms that might stand for generations. The Romano-Britons, who had lived under imperial rule for nearly 4 centuries, now faced a choice that would shape the future. Some fled to the wild mountains of Wales and Cornwall, carrying with them the dimming flame of Roman culture and Christian faith. Others remained and adapted, slowly learning to live under new rulers, new customs, and new understandings of their world. And some resisted, taking up arms to defend what had been theirs, fighting battles that would echo through the centuries in legend and in song. It was during this unsettled time that a figure known to us as Arthur may have taken shape, not yet the shining knight of later tales, but perhaps a resolute war leader, rallying the last remnants of Romano-British resistance against the Saxon tide. Whether he was one man or many, or only myth, The Arthurian legend speaks to something deeply true, a world on the brink of vanishing, and a dream of what might yet be saved. The Saxon kingdoms that eventually emerged from this upheaval were unlike anything that had come before. They were not the orderly provinces of Roman design, but intimate, personal realms built on loyalty between a leader and his warriors, between protector and those he shielded. The king was no distant emperor in a marble palace, but a war leader who fought beside his men, who rewarded loyalty with gold and land, and who embodied the virtues his people prized most. In great wooden halls, warriors gathered around fires that cast flickering shadows on painted walls and carved beams. And in these spaces, the Scop the Court poet sang of monsters and heroes, of courage and doom. Their language, a forebear to our own, was rich in rhythm and metaphor, able to carry both the roar of battle and the quiet sorrow of fate. When they sang of Beowulf fighting the creature Grendel, they were doing more than passing time. They were asking, again and again, what does it mean to be a hero? Their religion, like their society, was layered and deep. They worshipped gods whose echoes survive in the names of our days. T, god of war; Woden, the wanderer in search of wisdom; Thunor, who wielded thunder; and Frigg, goddess of love and fruitfulness. These gods were not distant or flawless like those of Rome. They were powerful but vulnerable, fated to fall, just as men must fall. Even the divine would not escape the final twilight, when fire and ice would consume the world. And yet, even as these pagan realms took root, another force was quietly preparing to change everything. In the wind-swept monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, monks had preserved not only Christian texts, but fragments of ancient learning. Their Christianity was distinct, fierce in devotion, passionate in scholarship, and unyielding in its drive to spread the word. And soon their feet would carry that message southward into Anglo-Saxon lands. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons was no sudden event. It was slow, complex, and filled with negotiation. It did not replace one faith with another overnight, but wove the new belief into the old, sometimes gently, sometimes not, and always with patience. When missionaries like Columba and Aidan reached the lands of Northumbria, they did not find savages. They found thriving societies, rich in their own traditions of law, poetry, and craftsmanship. The challenge was not to erase what was there, but to make Christianity speak in a way that honored those deep roots, even as it transformed them. King Edwin of Northumbria, one of the first great rulers to embrace the new faith, once compared life to a sparrow flying through a warm, firelit hall on a cold winter's night. It comes in from the dark, enjoys a brief moment of warmth and light, and vanishes into the dark once more. Christianity, he believed, offered the hope that beyond the darkness there might be more, that death might not be the end. And in that gentle metaphor, something essential is revealed. The Anglo-Saxon worldview was not hopeless, simply accepted the fleeting nature of all things, that halls would one day fall, that warriors would perish, that gold would tarnish. What mattered was to live bravely and to be remembered. Christianity did not dismiss this view, but promised to fulfill it, to offer eternity to those who embraced the faith. And so the conversion unfolded navenly, kingdom by kingdom, motive by motive. Some rulers were swayed by faith. Others saw alliances to be made. Still others converted for love through Christian wives or trusted counselors. The result was a tapestry of belief patched together over generations. And in 664 AD, a defining moment arrived. The Synod of Whitby brought leaders of the Celtic and Roman traditions together to resolve their differences. The matters at hand may sound small to modern ears: the correct date of Easter, the proper haircut for a monk, but they were reflections of something deeper. They were about unity, authority, and identity. The decision to follow Roman practice connected the English Church more firmly to the continent, to Rome's intellectual and spiritual traditions. And from that choice, the shape of English Christianity would be drawn for centuries to come. In the quiet northern reaches of England, where sea mists drift across fields of heather and ancient stones whisper old prayers, the monasteries of Northumbria rose like beacons of light. Places like Wearmouth and Jarrow, names now spoken with reverence, were more than collections of cloisters and chapels. They were fountains of knowledge, illuminating the world beyond their stone walls. Within these sacred enclaves, some of the greatest treasures of early medieval culture were born. Among them, the Lindisfarne Gospel's pages, so vividly alive with color and pattern they seem to breathe, with swirling Celtic interlace and glowing pigments drawn from distant lands. The manuscript is a perfect fusion of faith and artistry. Each page is a quiet miracle, a devotion rendered in ink, created not for glory, but as an offering to the divine. Here, too, lived the Venerable Bede, a humble monk of immense mind. Within the quiet discipline of Jarrow's cloister, he wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, a work that would reach far beyond its time. In its pages, Bede gave shape to a people still discovering who they were. He did not simply record the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons. He helped define a shared identity, one that reached beyond the borders of kings and kingdoms. These monasteries were not merely places of prayer, nor simple refuges from the world's strife. They were alive with purpose, vital centers of community, economy, and diplomacy. They managed sprawling estates, oversaw intricate farming systems, and welcomed travelers with food, shelter, and healing care. The monks within them were not removed from life, they were woven into it. They copied ancient manuscripts, taught the children of nobles, advised kings, and carried messages between warring realms. Their hands shaped parchment, but also policy. Their voices carried both scripture and wisdom. By the dawn of the 8th century, Anglo-Saxon England had become something remarkable, a society where the vigor of Germanic warrior culture met the quiet strength of Christian civilization. Across its lands, powerful kingdoms like Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and Kent were rising in splendor. They crafted laws, built alliances, and commissioned art of stunning refinement. Trade routes reached far beyond the sea, connecting English goods and ideas to the wider world. English monks crossed the Channel to spread the gospel in foreign lands, while English thinkers contributed to the growing intellectual spark of what would become the Carolingian Renaissance. It was, in many ways, a golden age. And like all golden ages, it was not to last. Across the stormy waters of the North Sea, in the fjords of Norway, and the low islands of Denmark, another people watched, a people of sea and blade, of songs sung to the wind and gods carved from oak. They, too, were warriors, but their gods were older, hungrier, and less forgiving. Their way of life prized courage above comfort, honor above peace, and they had mastered a craft that would make them legends: shipbuilding. Their vessels were sleek, fast, and fearsome, able to cross open seas with ease and glide silently up the shallowest rivers. With these dragon-proud ships, they could strike swiftly vanish quickly, and bring terror to the unprepared. For them, raiding was no shameful crime, but a noble path to glory. Their society celebrated boldness, rewarded cunning, and revered those who carved their names into the saga of time. And so it was that on June 8th, 793, as a pale morning mist clung to the waves off Northumbria, the first omen appeared. Dark shapes on the horizon, long ships cutting through the water with silent menace. Their destination was not a castle nor a king's hall, but something far more devastating. They struck Lindisfarne, the Holy Island, the beating heart of Northumbrian Christianity. What followed was horror. The monastery was plundered, its monks slaughtered or enslaved, its relics desecrated. The shock was profound. To the Anglo-Saxon mind, this was not just violence, it was sacrilege, a violation of the sacred, a sign that the world was slipping from divine order into chaos. The men who carried out the raid would become known by a name that echoed like thunder through the chronicles: Vikings. But these raiders were no mindless barbarians. Their attacks were calculated. They understood where wealth was kept. Monasteries, with their gold chalices, jeweled crosses, and silken vestments, were perfect targets. They knew the monks would not fight back. They knew that to strike the sacred was to strike at the soul. And so they did again and again. In the years that followed, more monasteries burned, more settlements fell. The Vikings had mastered the art of the sudden strike. They would appear like ghosts, seize treasure and captives, then vanish before anyone could organize a defense. Their shallow ships allowed them to travel far inland, along rivers once considered safe, spreading fear into the very heart of the countryside. But this was only the beginning. By the mid-9th century, Viking ambition had grown. Raiding alone no longer satisfied. They came not merely to steal, but to stay. In 865, a formidable force landed in East Anglia. It was not a band of raiders, it was a host of conquest. They were called the Great Heathen Army, and they marched not in chaos, but with purpose. Led by legendary figures names like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan, they moved with precision, toppling kingdom after kingdom. The old order of Anglo-Saxon England began to fracture. Some, like King Edmund of East Anglia, chose to die in defiance, refusing to yield. Others, like the nobles of Northumbria, surrendered or fled. Kingdoms crumbled under the weight of northern steel. But in the south, in Wessex, something else stirred a flicker of resistance, a quiet resolve. There, a young king rose to meet the storm. His name was Alfred, and he would be called the Great. Alfred's genius was not only in battle, though he was a warrior of considerable skill. His greatness lay in understanding. He knew that the Vikings were not simply an enemy to be defeated. They were a force that exposed the weakness of division, of a land fractured by petty kings and ancient rivalries. To resist them, England had to become something it had never been before united. His first true trial came in the harsh winter of 878. The Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise assault on Chippenham, catching Alfred unaware. The king barely escaped, fleeing into the marshlands of Somerset, his followers few and desperate. For a time, it seemed as though all was lost. Alfred became a fugitive, hiding in the reeds, the crown of Wessex slipping through his fingers. And yet, from that low place, hope returned. Through ancient systems of signal beacons and messengers, word spread. The king lives, resistance lives. Slowly, the men of Wessex gathered not because they were commanded, but because they believed. From farms and forests, from halls and hovels, they came, not just to fight, but to protect something greater than themselves. The Battle of Edington was fought in May of that year. Outnumbered, outmatched, the Anglo-Saxon forces fought not for conquest, but for survival. When at last the Viking shield wall broke, it was more than a military victory, was a shattering of myth. The Vikings could bleed, they could lose, but Alfred's true brilliance shone not in the battle, but in what followed. He did not merely drive the Vikings out, he made peace. The Treaty of Wedmore was struck with Guthrum, establishing a border between English and Viking lands. Guthrum agreed to convert to Christianity, with Alfred himself as his godfather, a gesture as symbolic as it was strategic. This moment marked the beginning of something new. The Danois, as the Viking-held lands were called, would retain their customs and leaders, but over time they would adopt English laws, Christian faith, and the rhythms of a settled life. The two peoples, once enemies, began to shape each other, culturally, spiritually, and even linguistically. Meanwhile, Alfred turned his gaze inward. The war had left more than scorched fields. It had burned away the foundations of learning, faith, and governance. The great monasteries lay in ruin, their libraries lost, their teachers dead. Alfred knew that rebuilding England required more than swords. It required schools, scriptoria, and scholars. And so he began to rebuild, not just walls, but minds. He translated key Latin texts into English, commissioned new manuscripts, and invited learned men from across the seas to teach. He reformed legal codes, organized defenses, and created a navy. In doing so, he laid the foundation for something that had never truly existed, a single English nation. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another night. Let the fire in your mind burn low now. Let the echoes of battle and prayer fade into the soft silence of sleep. For though the winds of history never cease to blow, tonight, in the quiet calm of your rest, you have walked through centuries and witnessed the rise of kings and kingdoms. And soon, when we return again, the tale will continue deeper into the heart of medieval England, toward the forging of a realm that would one day shape the world. In the softening twilight of a kingdom scarred by war but stirred by hope, Alfred the Great turned his gaze not only to swords and shields, but to something deeper, to words, to wisdom, to the slow healing of minds. Having defended his realm from Viking fire and fury, he now set about rescuing something equally precious, the light of learning. Alfred envisioned a land where knowledge, once hoarded in Latin texts and Roman ruins, could be breathed anew in the language of the people. He translated cherished works with his own hand, guiding old wisdom into English, where it could take root and flourish. In this quiet revolution, education was not reserved for cloistered monks or distant courts. It was placed within reach of young nobles, who learned to read the world in the words of their mother tongue. Perhaps no gift of Alfred's better captured this spirit than the Anglo-Saxon chronicler, living thread of time stitched in English, not Latin, more than parchment and ink. It was a mirror of memory, a voice for a people finding their name. It chronicled triumphs and trials, gave shape to the past, and offered the promise of continuity. For the first time, England could see itself reflected in its own story, shared across shires and valleys. But Alfred's renewal reached far beyond the written page. His laws, known as the Doom Book, gathered the traditions of scattered kingdoms and knit them into a unified code. He did not simply preserve what had been, he shaped what ought to be. Mercy, justice, intention, these became as central as punishment. In the glow of Christian teaching, his laws began to reflect not only order, but grace. They sought to shield the powerless and temper vengeance with fairness. The law, under Alfred, became not a tool of rule, but a reflection of moral purpose. Equally bold was the transformation of military life. The seasonal levies, once the backbone of English defense, had shown their weakness against Viking precision. Farmers could no longer drop their plows for a few weeks of battle, only to return to ruined fields. Alfred reimagined the system. One part of the army would serve, while the other toiled, preserving both food and freedom. From this vision, a new kind of readiness was born, one that balanced duty with survival. Yet Alfred's strategy reached beyond battlefield formations. Behind their timbered walls and ditches, a quiet revolution stirred. These were not mere garrisons. They were seeds of civilization. Streets were carefully laid, homes and workshops assigned, markets protected by royal decree. They became places where craftsmen, traders, and thinkers could build something lasting. Trade flowed through these strongholds like rivers through valleys. Goods and ideas traveled alongside coin and conversation. These new towns did more than defend, they connected and cultivated. The ripples of Alfred's efforts echoed into the reigns of his descendants. Edward the Elder and Ethelstan carried forward their father's vision, strengthening the burr system and reclaiming lands that had once bowed to the Viking sword. Viking settlers, once feared as destroyers, were welcomed if they bent the knee to English law. It was not always peaceful, but it was profoundly effective. Ethelstan, in particular, achieved what had long seemed impossible: the true unification of England. At the Battle of Brunanburh in 937, a coalition of Norse, Scots, and Welsh sought to shatter this fragile order. The clash was fierce, an ocean of steel and blood. So devastating was the slaughter that the chronicle remembered it in somber reverence. Never before had the island seen such a harvest of the sword. Yet it was a victory, hard-won and absolute. Ethelstan emerged not merely as a king of a region, but as the sovereign of a people. And so, the 10th century unfolded as a time of rebirth. A uniquely English culture began to flower, a weave of Anglo-Saxon roots, Christian spirit, and Viking resilience. Monasteries, once raised, rose again in quiet defiance, grander than before. Their libraries filled with brilliant manuscripts, delicate illuminations that rivaled the art of any court in Europe. One such treasure, the Benedictional of St. Thelwold, glowed with a radiance that no conquest could dim. Architecture transformed from the humble timber of old to the carved stone of new ambition. The churches and monasteries of this age bore not only the marks of faith, but the fingerprints of a growing people. The English Church, too, began to find its voice. Harmony between Roman doctrine and native custom, between the wisdom of the papacy and the earthbound piety of its people. Scholars and saints crossed the seas, bringing English thought to foreign courts. From France to the German lands, English monks and priests were called upon for their insight, their books, and their teaching. The learning preserved in distant abbeys now became an export as well as an inheritance. Yet, of all the transformations, none was more powerful than the slow emergence of something that had once seemed distant, a national soul. The petty rivalries of old kingdoms began to dissolve, not through conquest alone, but through shared memory and common cause. The long wars, the hard-won peace, the law and the learning, these bound the people to one another. It was no longer just Wessex or Mercia, was England. The reign of Edgar the Peaceful, from 959 to 975, embodied this unity. His coronation at Bath in 973 was a ceremony not just of state, but of sanctity. Welsh princes, Scottish kings all paid homage. The ritual was crafted to reflect divine favor, a mirror of heaven's order on earth. In Edgar's crown, the people saw more than rule. They saw purpose and a shared destiny under God. Administratively, this England was ahead of its time. It was a land of shires, each overseen by a sheriff who answered to the king. Justice was dispensed at local courts, while royal commands flowed through writs sealed with authority. The king could speak, and his voice would carry to every corner of the realm a feat rare in Europe. The economy bloomed in tandem. Towns thrived. Trade expanded. London, once a Roman outpost, had become a hub of global exchange. English silver coins were found as far as Russia and the Mediterranean. English merchants traded not just in goods, but in ideas, in influence, in ambition. The kingdom's prosperity spoke of peace, but also invited danger. For unity, while powerful, also made the realm tempting. Where once a patchwork of kingdoms offered little prize, now a single, wealthy land stood ripe for conquest. Across the North Sea, the Danish king's descendants, of those same Viking raiders, now ruled an empire of their own, and they remembered England. It was during the reign of Thellard, known to us as the Unready, that these new threats emerged. His name did not reflect cowardice, but poor counsel-inrid, ill-advised. The Viking raids that began in the 980s were not the quick strikes of old. These were organized invasions designed not to plunder, but to rule. These new attackers came in force and stayed. Their fleets were larger, their armies more disciplined, their aims clearer. And England, after decades of peace, was no longer prepared. The once vibrant military system had decayed. The spirit that had burned at Eddington had grown cold. When Sweyn Forkbard, king of Denmark, arrived with his armies, he found a land weary and uncertain. By the early 11th century, England fell not to chaos, but to another king, Sweyn, and later his son Canute, conquered not by burning it all down, but by fitting themselves into its shape. The great institutions, the laws, the towns, the courts, remained. Under Danish rule, they endured, and in some cases, even flourished. Canute ruled from 1016 to 1035, and he did so wisely. He saw England not as a prize, but as a jewel to be polished. He respected its ways, upheld its customs, and wove himself into its legacy. His reign proved that effective kingship need not be born of native blood. Governance, after all, was not merely about lineage, was about vision and order and justice. But nothing in this age was permanent. After Sienna's death, his sons could not maintain the delicate balance he had achieved. The kingdom trembled once again, and into that opening stepped a figure from the old line Edward, the Confessor. In 1042, Edward returned not to the England of Edgar, but to something new. The years of Danish rule had changed the land. New nobles held sway. The church had deepened its ties to the continent. Ambitions stirred in quiet corners. What Edward inherited was not the golden past, but a complicated present. And though he carried the memory of a gentler time, he now faced forces that no single king could fully command. The stage, quietly and inexorably, was being set for yet another transformation. As the final years of Edward the Confessor's reign unfolded, a quiet but undeniable shift was taking place. England, long marked by its insular nature, was now being drawn into the greater current of European politics, a web of influence stretching from the icy fjords of Norway to the flourishing court of Normandy. It became increasingly evident that the old days of separation were fading fast. A new world was approaching, one where power belonged not to those who clung to old traditions, but to those who could navigate the turbulent tides of change sweeping across the continent. Across the English Channel, in the Duchy of Normandy, a force was gathering that would soon crash upon English shores like an unrelenting storm. A new generation of Norman rulers had begun to rise, ambitious, battle-hardened, and shaped by a political world where strength and cunning were the only currency. Among them stood a man who would redefine the fate of England, William of Normandy. Born into chaos, William called the Bastard in his youth grew up amidst conspiracies, assassination plots, and noble rebellion. His illegitimacy was a mark of vulnerability, and many expected him to fail. But against all odds, he endured. By the time William reached adulthood, he had done what few thought possible: transformed a fragmented and unstable duchy into one of the most formidable military powers in Europe. The Normans themselves were a fascinating people, descendants of Viking raiders, who had settled in northern France a mere century before. Yet unlike their Scandinavian kin who had ruled England under King Canute, the Normans had fully embraced continental customs, especially the feudal order that tied land, loyalty, and military service into a tight and complex hierarchy. In this martial society, Norman knights emerged as a new kind of warrior, heavily armored, mounted, and trained in the arts of war. They represented a revolution in military thinking. With their long lances, kite-shaped shields, and mail hauberks, they were nearly invincible in open-field combat. But it wasn't just their equipment that made them dangerous. It was their discipline, coordination, and strategic innovation. Norman cavalry could charge with precision, feint a retreat to lure enemies into traps, and seamlessly combine foot soldiers and horsemen in a style of warfare that stunned their enemies. But the Normans' strength was not purely military. Their duchy had also become a beacon of church reform and intellectual revival. Its monasteries bustled with scholars and scribes, exchanging ideas and manuscripts with centers of learning throughout Europe. Norman abbots and bishops were not merely figures in robes. They were advisors, generals, and political architects. Their close ties with the papacy in Rome ensured Normandy's place at the heart of a growing movement to reshape Christendom. And when the time came that religious alliance would give William something even more valuable than soldiers: divine justification. So, when Edward the Confessor died, childless, in January of 1066, the uncertain question of succession opened a door to the Normans, a door that once entered could never be closed. The kingdom Edward left behind was very different from the one he'd inherited. Years of Danish rule and continental influence had created a realm where the great earls wielded enormous power. Chief among them was Earl Godwin of Wessex and his son Harold, whose control over vast lands and loyal armies made them kingmakers in all but name. Edward's marriage to Edith, Godwin's daughter, had produced no heir, and with whispers of his vow of celibacy circulating in court, the royal line seemed likely to end with him. In the absence of a clear successor, multiple contenders emerged. Edgar the Theling, a royal blood relative, was still too young and powerless to claim the throne. Harold Godwinson unproven in battle and governance, had no royal lineage. William of Normandy, however, insisted he had been promised the crown by Edward himself during a visit in the 1050s, and that Harold had even sworn to support him, sealing the promise on holy relics during a secretive trip to Normandy in 1064. The details of that mysterious visit remain shrouded in debate, but Norman chronicles claim Harold's oath was sacred and binding. So when Harold accepted the crown following Edward's death, William did not see it as a political betrayal, but as a blasphemous act of perjury. What followed in the year 1066 would become one of the most storied succession crises in all of European history. Harold was chosen by the Witenagemot, the Council of English Nobles, as king, but in doing so, they triggered a storm from all sides. Harold would not face one challenger, but three, and each came with ambition burning like a torch in the dark. The first emerged from the North Harold's own estranged brother. Tostig had aligned with a formidable ally, Harald Hardrada, the legendary warrior king of Norway. Hardrada was no ordinary monarch. Towering in stature and reputation, he had once led the elite Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Emperor, fighting in lands as distant as the holy city of Jerusalem and the icy plains of Scandinavia. His claim to the English throne was slim, rooted in distant treaties between Norse and Danish rulers. But his fame and fearsome army made him a threat no one could ignore. In September 1066, Hardrada's fleet sailed into the Humber estuary 300 ships strong, an immense host by medieval standards. It may have numbered as many as 15,000 seasoned warriors, and unlike the Norse raids of the past, this was not a plundering expedition. It was a full-scale invasion. Their first encounter came at Fulford, where the Norwegians decisively crushed the English forces led by the Earls of the North. Earl Mercar and Earl Edwin were defeated, and much of the northern aristocracy fell with them. News of the disaster reached Harold quickly. In an astonishing display of leadership and logistics, he mustered his army and marched north at a pace that left observers breathless. Covering nearly 200 miles in less than 2 weeks, Harold's forces caught the Norwegians entirely off guard. At Stamford Bridge, on September 25th, the English arrived to find the Norwegians scattered, many without armor, basking in the false security of recent victory. The clash that followed was brutal and legendary. The great Harald Hardrada fought with the courage that had made him a legend, but even he could not overcome the surprise and fury of Harold's counterattack. According to Norse sagas, the towering king was struck down by an arrow to the throat as he rallied his men. The losses were devastating. So many died that only 24 ships were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. With that, the age of Viking conquest came to a dramatic endfell, not by time, but by the swift and surgical blows of the English army. But Harold's hard-won victory bore a hidden cost. His forces were weary, bloodied, and far from home. And even as the fires of victory still smoldered in the north, a second storm was brewing across the Channel. In Normandy, William had completed his preparations. He had secured papal blessing, declared his cause righteous, and assembled a coalition of knights from across northern France, lured by promises of English land and riches. The Pope's endorsement changed everything. With the sacred banner of Rome flying above his fleet, William's cause was transformed from political ambition to holy crusade. Knights who might have hesitated now saw themselves as warriors of God, not merely opportunists. William's invasion became a sanctified mission, a war of justice and faith. On September 27th, his fleet of nearly 700 ships set sail from St. Valery Asurcum, a marvel of organization and daring. It carried not only warriors, but the horses, weapons, provisions, and siege gear needed to sustain a prolonged campaign. Guided by seasoned navigators, the fleet crossed safely and landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast. The location was no accident. Sussex was Harold's power base, the very land from which he drew strength. By landing there, William threw down a gauntlet. This was not merely a conquest of England, it was a challenge to Harold himself, right on his doorstep. The psychological shock of the Norman landing was profound. Harold, fresh from his triumph in the north, was suddenly forced to abandon any hope of rest or celebration. The victory at Stamford Bridge had barely been won when news arrived that changed everything. Over the following 2 weeks, a quiet and deadly struggle unfolded, one of careful calculation and relentless movement. The game was on, and Harold, driven by urgency and instinct, acted without hesitation. Despite the exhaustion of his weary men, he rallied his forces and began the long march south. His hope was to replicate the same strategy that had worked so decisively against rapid movement, tactical surprise, and the advantage of choosing the battlefield. He aimed to crush the invaders before they could take root. But this time, he faced not a foreign warlord raiding from afar, but William, Duke of Normandy. William was not like Harold Hardrada. He had not risen through valor alone, but through years of surviving court intrigue, rebellion, and betrayal. From childhood, he had learned to lead from the shadows, to strike with precision, and to always expect treachery. William understood his situation in England was perilous. His position rested on speed and boldness. As their armies finally met on October 14th, 1066, near a hill called Senlac, just inland from the coastal town of Hastings, they represented two clashing worlds, two visions of warfare, leadership, and destiny. Harold's troops were traditional English infantry, proud, seasoned, and grounded in centuries of custom. They bore swords, spears, and the iconic battle axe. They did not ride horses into battle. They stood their ground, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, forming the mighty wall that had defended England time and again. Positioned on high ground, they waited silent at first, then shouting their cries of war as they saw the Normans approach. Theirs was the defense of homeland, of ancient ways, of a kingdom that had withstood Vikings and Danes alike. William's army was altogether different. His archers, drawn from Brittany, Flanders, and Normandy, had the range and power to rain death from afar. But William's true advantage was not any single type of warrior. It was the way his forces worked together. Cavalry, infantry, and archers united in a coordinated machine of war. This was not the old way of fighting, it was a modern military doctrine, and it would test the strength of England's traditions to the very limit. The battle itself was fierce, prolonged, and filled with moments of high drama. The Norman cavalry charged repeatedly up the hill, seeking to pierce the English shield wall through sheer force. Time after time, they were repelled. English axes felled horse and rider alike, the defenders showing no sign of giving ground. The fighting dragged on for hours, neither side able to tip the scales. The dead piled high. Hope and despair traded places with every failed charge and every counterattack. Then, as the sun lowered in the sky, a terrible rumor swept the Norman ranks: William was dead. For a moment, panic rippled through the invaders. Men hesitated, thinking their cause lost. But then, William did something only a great commander could do. He lifted his helmet, showed his face to his troops, and rode among them, rallying their courage. His voice rang out, his presence calmed the storm, and what came next would become legend. In a maneuver of tactical brilliance, William ordered a false retreat. Parts of his army turned and fled down the hill. Believing the Normans were breaking, sections of the English line gave chase, abandoning their positions in the shield wall. It was a fatal error. The Normans wheeled around and encircled the pursuing English, cutting them down with devastating precision. It was the beginning of the end. The final blow came when Harold himself fell, fighting beneath his banner, struck by Norman swords and arrows. The king, who had seemed unstoppable just weeks earlier, now lay lifeless on the battlefield. Around him fell the noblest of his realm, the earls and thanes, who had governed England for generations. The psychological consequences of the battle were as great as its military ones. England had not simply lost a monarch, had lost the very structure that defined its political and spiritual life. The powerful earls were dead or had fled. The church, once a stabilizing force in crises, now faced a conqueror with very different ideas about authority. For ordinary Englishmen, the defeat shattered the world they had known. In a single afternoon, centuries of tradition were swept away. William's march to London after Hastings was not just a military maneuver, was a campaign of deliberate psychological conquest. Rather than march directly to the capital, he moved slowly through the southern shires, destroying crops, homes, and villages in his path. His message was simple and brutal. Resistance would be met with ruin. As he passed through Kent, Surrey, and the Thames Valley, town after town submitted. Their leaders knew the old world had died at Hastings, and that survival now meant finding a place in a new one. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. It was a carefully crafted ceremony. English bishops stood beside Norman barons. Latin prayers echoed beneath stone arches as the crown was placed upon William's head. But outside, in the streets, there was unrest, rumors of rebellion, shouting, even riots. The coronation was a moment of triumph, but also a signal that this was only the beginning. Conquest was not the same as control. The kingdom William now claimed was not a unified realm, but a patchwork of territories held together by fragile loyalties and sheer force. Many of the great lords who had submitted after Hastings still ruled their lands, and many waited for a chance to reclaim what they had lost. Among the people, fear and suspicion ran deep. The church, though outwardly compliant, still harbored its own sense of identity and purpose. William had won a crown, yes, but the kingdom itself remained elusive. The months that followed brought the first serious test. In the spring of 1067, William returned to Normandy to secure his rule there. During his absence, rebellion broke out across England like fire through dry brush. The lords who had knelt to him rose in defiance. In the north, Edgar the Feeling, the last living heir to the old royal house, returned from exile, seeking the throne many believed was rightfully his. These uprisings were not spontaneous, but William, when he returned, showed exactly why he had survived so many dangers in his life. His response was swift and unrelenting. He landed with fresh troops and resolved to crush the uprisings not just with arms, but with terror. The patient conqueror of Hastings gave way to a ruler who now believed that fear, not mercy, would bring peace. What followed was a campaign of controlled devastation. The rebellion would not just be defeated, it would be erased. Entire villages were set aflame, fields laid waste, livestock slaughtered. The Norman knights, so skilled in war, proved equally effective in suppression. They left behind regions where no homes stood, no crops grew, no people remained. The worst came in the winter of 1069. The north of England, long a centre of resistance, rose again this time with Danish support. A fleet sailed into the Humber. For a brief moment, it seemed the Normans might be driven out, but William responded with terrifying determination. In what would become known as the Harrying of the North, he ordered the complete devastation of Yorkshire and its surrounding regions. Villages were burned to ash, granaries destroyed, and survivors left to starve in a freezing winter. Chroniclers later described a land where no smoke rose from any hearth, where the dead lay unburied, and the living fled or perished. This campaign marked a turning point. The conquest of England was no longer just a matter of battles. It had become a reshaping of the land itself, scorched earth policy, aimed at erasing the last remnants of resistance. In the cold shadow of northern England's vast and wind-swept moors, a silence settled over the land, not a peaceful, quiet, but one born from fire and ruin. For long and dreadful months, Norman forces moved with grim purpose, leaving behind nothing that could nourish life. They burned the granaries, they destroyed the mills, they shattered the bridges that linked village to village, and scattered salt into the fertile fields, ensuring that even hope would not take root there again. Entire communities collapsed beneath the weight of this calculated devastation. Families, driven by hunger and fear, fled southward in weary columns. They carried what few belongings they could, salvage blankets, tools, bits of food, and left behind everything else, their homes, their pasts, and the graves of their kin. In their wake stretched an eerie stillness, one that would linger in the hills and dales of Yorkshire for generations to come. The true power of this campaign was not just in its destruction, but in the message it delivered. That message, whispered from village to village, carried by gaunt-faced refugees and wide-eyed survivors, spread across all of England. This was no ordinary conqueror. William of Normandy would not be placated. He would not wait patiently to be absorbed into English tradition. He would rule through fire and iron, if necessary, and he would rather preside over a barren wasteland than tolerate rebellion. And so, the resistance that once surged in the months after Hastings, those scattered embers of rebellion were quietly extinguished. Not in glorious battle, not with swords clashing under banners, but in cold, silent retreats. Noble families who once dared to oppose the Normans saw the cost and turned away. They knew now what defiance would bring, not honor but annihilation. Yet, even as William showed his brutal resolve, he was also crafting something lasting. His conquest was not merely of land, it was of the very concept of kingship itself. What rose from the ashes of northern villages was not just a subjugated England, but a transformed one. William brought with him more than soldiers. He brought an entire reimagining of how power would flow, how wealth would be managed, and how loyalty would be bound together in an intricate new web. This web was the feudal system, not a mere hierarchy of military ranks, but a layered design in which every person, every lord, every knight, every farmer and shepherd held their place under the crown. All land now belonged to the king, either directly or through layers of allegiance. From the grandest earl to the humblest tenant, all owed something to someone who in turn owed something to the king. It was power expressed through land, and land expressed through loyalty. To truly understand what this meant, we need only look to the Doomsday Book, William's Great Survey, completed in 1086. Never before had a medieval realm been mapped in such astonishing detail. William wanted to know, with precision, what he owned. How many oxen pulled, how many plows, how many pigs roamed each forest, how many fish ponds fed each estate. It was more than a tax record. It was a portrait of a kingdom seen through the lens of power and productivity. The surveyors who walked the length and breadth of England were not simply collecting figures. They were defining reality. They were anchoring the new order in parchment and ink, making it permanent. Every field measured, every mill counted, every soul acknowledged. In doing so, they gave shape to a kingdom no longer ruled by tradition or inheritance, but by command and calculation. The nobility that emerged under Norman rule was unlike the Anglo-Saxon leaders of old, where once power was personal, bestowed through kinship, loyalty, and the exchange of treasure. Now it was bureaucratic. Norman barons were landlords in the most literal sense, holding estates granted by the king, their authority secured not by lineage but by royal favor. Their role was to extract wealth, manage labor, enforce land, above all, to obey. And at the heart of this new aristocracy stood the castle. These were not merely military outposts, but the bones of Norman control. The landscape, once dotted with wooden halls and open meadows, now bristled with towers and stone keeps. Some were modest, simple earthworks and timber walls, but others, like the mighty stone fortresses of London and Rochester, were enormous undertakings, crafted to last for centuries. They loomed over towns and countryside, casting literal and symbolic shadows. The most iconic of these was the White Tower in London, begun by William himself. Its pale stone walls, brought from across the sea, rose above the Thames like a defiant monument to foreign rule. But it was more than a fortress. It was a palace, a treasury, a prison, a place where the machinery of government turned behind thick walls, and where the crown's reach could be felt with awe or dread. The church, too, did not escape transformation. The conquest reached deep into its sacred spaces, replacing English bishops with Norman ones, many of them scholars and reformers brought over to realign the English church with continental practice. One such figure was Lanfranc of Bec, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. Under his guidance, monastic life was reshaped, cathedrals were rebuilt, and the clergy educated in the rigors of both scripture and governance. The very architecture of the faith changed. Gone were the modest wooden churches of the Saxon era. In their place rose massive stone cathedrals, awe-inspiring structures that seemed to stretch heavenward, thick with symbolic meaning. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093, remains one of the crowning achievements of Romanesque design. Its ribbed vaults, sweeping arches, and soaring columns, a physical embodiment of Norman spiritual authority. But of all the transformations wrought by conquest, perhaps the most subtle and far-reaching was the one that shaped the very way people spoke. The Normans, after all, spoke French, and they brought that language with them into the courts, the castles, and the culture of high society. Latin remained the language of the church and the law. English, the tongue of the people, endured in kitchens, fields, and village squares. And over time, all three entwined, producing a rich, hybrid vocabulary. Words of war and wealth, of law and luxury, flooded the English tongue. This linguistic blending was not immediate. It unfolded slowly, generation by generation. But the result was a language like no other, flexible, expressive tongue that bore the weight of both Saxon roots and Norman elegance. And with it came a literature that reflected this cultural fusion. The chansons de geste, those French epic tales of chivalry and conquest, echoed in the halls of Norman lords. Meanwhile, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, maintained in monasteries, continued to record England's story, sometimes with grudging admiration, sometimes with quiet resistance. The law, too, changed. The localized, customary courts of the Anglo-Saxon world gave way to a more centralized legal system. Royal justices began traveling from shire to shire, enforcing laws that came not from old traditions, but from the king's decree. Over time, these decrees formed the backbone of English common law legal tradition, rooted not just in precedent, but in royal authority. This system offered a surprising stability, one that allowed trade to grow and cities to expand. Farming techniques improved, markets were established, roads were maintained, not out of local obligation, but because royal interest demanded it. England began to connect more fully to the European economy, and its prized wool became a cornerstone of trade. Even the arrival of Jewish communities, invited by William to provide financial services, played a key role in the economic transformation. Barred from land ownership, these families became essential to credit networks, providing the loans that allowed for everything from castle building to market development. Still, beneath the surface of Norman order, tensions endured. The common people, the villagers and peasants who bore the burdens of taxation, labor, and military obligation, kept alive memories of a freer time. They remembered the old ways, the old songs, the older justice. And in quiet corners of England, that memory began to stir. The reign of William's sons revealed the strengths and cracks in the system he had built. When the conqueror died in 1087, his sons, Robert, William Rufus, and Henry contended for the throne. Despite all his administration and record-keeping, William could not impose order beyond the grave. Kingship in this age still depended on loyalty, charisma, and military might. William Rufus, who claimed the throne with speed and sharp cunning, proved a troubling figure. He was known for his greed, his mockery of the church, and his refusal to secure an heir. Under his rule, the church was treated not as a sacred institution, but as a source of income. Bishoprics went unsold or were auctioned. Faith was reduced to currency. His sudden death in 1100 whether by hunting accident or assassination cleared the path for his younger brother, Henry. Unlike his brother, Henry had prepared, trained in governance, fluent in both languages of his kingdom. He symbolized the beginning of a synthesis. Under Henry, the structures of Norman rule merged more deeply with English traditions, and in this quiet evolution, something remarkable began to take shape. Not just a conquered land, but a unified one, a realm of stone and parchment, of French and English, of church and castle, law and memory, a realm that would, in time, no longer be Saxon or Norman, but something new. But that part of our tale lies ahead, in another chapter of this winding journey through the quiet fog of medieval time. As we move forward, we find a young Prince clever, observant, and quieter than his more martial brothers. This was the boy who would one day become Henry II. While others fought, Henry studied. While they learned the arts of war, he listened and watched, learning the gentler but equally powerful tools of administration and diplomacy. These lessons, often overlooked in youth, would serve him well when the unpredictable currents of fate finally delivered him the crown. Unlike the kings before him, men who ruled through personal charm or sheer military might, Henry grasped a deeper truth: that power built only on personality dies with the man, that no kingdom can endure if its foundations crumble at each royal death. The endless cycles of instability that had haunted both the Norman and English dynasties had taught him this, and he would be determined not to repeat those mistakes. So, when Henry came to the throne, one of his first acts was to issue a document, a charter, not merely a pledge to ease the minds of nobles in a turbulent time, but something larger, something almost revolutionary. The Charter of Liberties, its very name promising something new, outlined a framework for how power should behave. In it, Henry swore to uphold the ancient laws of Edward the Confessor, the last great Saxon king. He promised to rein in the harsh, often arbitrary demands that had stained his brother William Rufus's reign. And, most importantly, he promised to govern not by his own changing whims, but by the customs that had grown through time. It was, in essence, a contract between ruler and ruled. And though few recognized it at the time, this was a remarkable shift in political thinking. It planted the seed of the idea that a king's authority was not limitless, that government might be grounded in structure, not simply personality. During his 35-year reign, Henry would bring this vision to life. He oversaw a transformation, not in battles or sieges, but in the mechanisms of governance themselves. His was a quiet revolution, one of ink and parchment, of officials and records, of taxes carefully counted and laws consistently applied. At the center of it all stood the Exchequer, a new institution that would shape the English government for generations. Named after the checkered cloth used to perform calculations, black and white squares, like a giant chessboard did, became the realm's financial heart. Royal officials, particularly sheriffs, were summoned to this place to explain themselves, what they had collected in taxes, how they had spent royal funds, what lands they had administered. The Exchequer recorded it all, scroll upon scroll, written by scribes with painstaking care, creating a record not only for the moment, but for centuries to come. Through this process, Henry created a continuity of government that could endure beyond his own reign. It was a profound shift from personality to procedure, from custom to codification. And yet, he did not stop there. His legal reforms reshaped justice throughout the realm. Justices began to travel across England, not merely settling disputes, but laying the groundwork for a unified legal system. Their rulings were not one-time decisions. They were part of something larger, building blocks in a growing structure of law. These traveling judges began to replace the confusing patchwork of local customs that had ruled English life for centuries. The decisions they made, the precedents they established, and the procedures they followed slowly formed a new legal tradition. It was not based on the old ways or on tribal memory, but on royal authority. And eventually, this evolving framework became known as the common law system, so sturdy and fair that parts of it still shape legal systems today. Henry was also a master of political symbolism. His marriage to Matilda of Scotland was more than a romantic or dynastic match. It was a conscious act of healing. Matilda could trace her ancestry back to the old Anglo-Saxon kings, those rulers so deeply loved by the English before the Norman Conquest. Their union, celebrated in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey, sent a clear message. The Norman dynasty was no longer a foreign occupier, was now a part of England. From this union came children who bore both Norman strength and English heritage. Their bloodlines wove together the histories of conquest and continuity, promising a future where the two identities might be reconciled. The kingdom itself grew wealthier under Henry's rule. This prosperity did not arise by chance. It was the result of systems put in place over decades. England's resources were now systematically used, guided by Norman administrative skills, and often financed by Jewish capital. The Jewish communities in England, though often treated as outsiders, played a critical role in funding royal projects and the growing economy. Silver from the mines of Cumberland filled the royal treasury. The wool trade blossomed in the Cotswolds, creating one of England's most valuable exports. The grain fields of East Anglia yielded bountiful harvests. Together, these riches made Henry one of the wealthiest monarchs in Europe. His was not a poor, war-torn kingdom, but a growing power built on order and commerce. Yet, even prosperity has its price. To maintain his sprawling government, Henry levied heavy taxes. His legal reforms, while innovative, often disrupted long-held rights. His cultural policies brought change that many viewed as unwelcome. The weight of his rule, though orderly and efficient, was not light, and underneath the glitter of progress, tensions stirred. Some saw the king not as a reformer, but as an outsider still, one whose changes were imposed from above. And then came the tragedy that would unravel everything. On a cold November night in 1120, a ship set sail across the English Channel, a fine vessel filled with the cream of Norman nobility, young lords, heirs to vast estates, courtiers full of laughter and wine. Among them was Henry's son, William Etheling, the heir, the future of the dynasty. But the White Ship, as it was called, never reached England. It struck a rock and vanished beneath the waves. Almost no one survived. Henry's grief was immense, but more than that, he understood at once the scale of the political catastrophe. His careful plans, his systems, his laws, his marriage all had hinged on William, and now the heir was gone. Without a male successor, Henry faced the same problem that had doomed so many kings before him. Who would rule next? He chose, in desperation and hope, his daughter, Matilda. Matilda no longer simply his child, but now known as the Empress. Having been married to the Holy Roman Emperor was no ordinary woman. She was brilliant, trained in politics, and experienced in governance. She had ruled parts of Italy. She understood power. She had the mind of a sovereign, but she also had the misfortune of being a woman in a world still deeply uncertain about female rulers. Henry demanded that his barons swear to accept her as queen. They did, at least publicly, but their words were hesitant, their loyalty brittle. Even as they placed their hands on sacred relics and gave their oaths, many were already thinking ahead. Some feared losing power, others feared the very idea of a queen ruling alone. One among them, Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew and once a loyal supporter, watched quietly, planning his move. When Henry died in 1135, reportedly after feasting on lampreys, all that he had built began to collapse. The system he had crafted with such care, built on charters, laws, and courts, proved unable to stand on its own. Stephen seized the crown swiftly. He moved with speed, secured key cities, and offered generous promises to the nobility. The barons, many of whom had vowed to support Matilda, now conveniently forgot those promises. A man on the throne of one without a direct claim was, to them, safer than a woman. And so began a time of darkness. The years that followed became known not for battles won or laws passed, but for chaos. Chroniclers called it the anarchy, a word that captured the crumbling of order, the howling of wolves in once safe fields, the burning of towns, the rise of private warlords. This was more than a fight over succession. It was a test of whether the Norman system, carefully built to bind men in loyalty and service, could survive when loyalty vanished. Many barons, who had been administrators in Henry's reign, reverted to warriors. They fortified castles, raised private armies, and carved territories for themselves. The great stone keeps that had once symbolized royal strength became centers of defiance. The roads once traveled by royal judges became haunted and unsafe. Merchants abandoned markets, villages emptied. The land fell silent in fear. One monk wrote simply, "Christ and his saints slept." And yet, even in this time of unraveling, some pieces of Henry's design held firm. The exchequer, though diminished, continued to operate. Some royal courts still functioned, especially where the crown's writ could be enforced. The procedures established by Henry's justices endured, guarded by a new class of legal professionals who understood that knowledge once written and recorded had its own kind of power. Even as swords clashed and castles burned, scrolls were still unrolled, records were kept, precedents remembered. The question now was not whether Henry's system had failed, but whether it could endure long enough to be rebuilt. Even as the fires of civil war smoldered across the troubled land, the church endured steady, unshaken. Amid the violence and shifting loyalties, bishops and abbots acted not as warriors, but as patient mediators. With parchment instead of sword, they navigated between warring factions, always striving for some flicker of peace. And in time, peace did come not through decisive battle or dramatic conquest, but through the quiet wisdom of compromise, in the very spirit that so often defined the Normans' rule. In the year 1153, the Treaty of Wallingford was cinda delicate, pragmatic settlement that ended nearly 2 decades of anarchy. King Stephen would retain his crown until death, but the future belonged to another. Henry, the son of Empress Matilda, would succeed him. It was not a resolution born of ideology, but of necessity and agreement that bound together fractured loyalties and allowed a weary realm to breathe once more. And thus, with the death of Stephen, a new monarch rose, young Henry, soon to be known as Henry II. In him there seemed a chance to restore not only order, but the golden legacy of his grandfather, Henry I. Yet this new Henry brought with him something altogether different, a dominion vast and formidable, stretching from the wind-swept highlands of Scotland to the sun-drenched slopes of the Pyrenees. No English king before had held such reach, through inheritance and war, but most strikingly, through his union with Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's power blossomed. Eleanor, no ordinary consort, brought with her not only the wealth of southern France, but a culture steeped in poetry, music, and courtly elegance. Together, they ruled over a realm that was both fiercely practical and dazzlingly sophisticated, a kingdom of law and legacy, of troubadours and tax rolls. Henry, trained in the methods of Norman governance, wasted no time in turning chaos into order. The scars of civil war were still fresh, but he began the work of restoration with quiet resolve. The illicit castles hastily thrown up during the anarchy were pulled down, their stones repurposed to raise churches and span rivers. The royal forests were reclaimed and replenished, not only to serve as hunting grounds, but as a renewed source of revenue for the crown. He turned his attention to coinage stripping, away the degraded silver of wartime minting and restoring trust in the currency. Yet, of all his achievements, none would cast a longer shadow than the rebuilding of royal justice. Henry sought not merely to rule, but to govern. He set out to transform a land of feuding barons and scattered customs into a unified realm governed by consistent law. In 1164, the Constitutions of Clarendon laid the groundwork, a series of practical reforms. They clarified how justice was to be administered, binding the local and the royal, the spiritual and the temporal, into a cohesive whole. Royal courts, staffed by trained judges, became fixtures in the countryside, their rulings guided not by whim, but by written law. In time, these courts would grow into the beating heart of English legal tradition. But law, like fire, can both illuminate and burn. And soon Henry found himself in conflict, not with foreign kings or rebellious barons, but with a man once counted as a trusted friend, Thomas Becket. Once his chancellor, Becket had been elevated to Archbishop of Canterbury. But rather than serve as a compliant churchman, he embraced the spiritual weight of his new office with fierce devotion. The quarrel that followed was no mere disagreement. It was a deep and dangerous clash between crown and church, between the desire for administrative unity and the ancient independence of sacred authority. In the end, it would lead to blood. On a winter day in 1170, within the hallowed walls of Canterbury Cathedral, Becket fell beneath the swords of knights who believed, perhaps wrongly, that they acted in service to the king. The Christian world reeled. In death, Becket became more powerful than he had ever been in life. His shrine drew pilgrims from across Europe, his name whispered in reverence. Henry, racked with guilt and political pressure, made public penance kneeling in the cathedral, scourged by monks. A king bowed before the church. The message was unmistakable. Even the mightiest monarch was not above the authority of heaven. And yet, even as he knelt, the systems Henry had created continued to grow in strength and complexity. The machinery of justice he set in motion could no longer be fully controlled. Writs and procedures developed to bring order began to weave together into a body of law that stood apart from the will of any single king. Courts became more than tools of power. They became the voice of the realm itself. For the first time, ordinary people found themselves part of that voice. Juries were assembled not from barons or clerics, but from local men who could testify to facts, forming the bedrock of trial by jury. The principle that justice should be shared, not imposed, was quietly being born. Meanwhile, Henry's vast empire, stitched together from inheritance, conquest, and diplomacy, had reached its zenith. The so-called Angevin Empire was an immense and glittering thing. From the court at Chinon or Angers, the king could summon the fruits of many lands, the grain of Normandy, the wool of England, the wine of Gascony. His treasury swelled, funding not only armies, but diplomacy, architecture, and art. And art did flourish. The refined court of Aquitaine brought troubadours and poets, musicians and thinkers. The monasteries of Normandy offered a quiet brilliance in scholarship, while England's growing administration became a magnet for Europe's most able minds. Henry's empire was not only vast, but vibrantly a leva cosmopolitan blend of languages, customs, and ideals. Yet, within its brilliance, the first cracks began to form. Such a sprawling dominion was difficult to control. Henry's sons, each promised a share of the inheritance, grew restless. They had waited long, and some feared they would wait forever. Encouraged by enemies of the crown and by their own mother, Eleanor, they began to rebel. In 1173, a great revolt erupted. Henry's own children allied with the kings of France and Scotland in a desperate bid to shatter the empire and claim their portions. For 2 years, the land was again consumed by war. But Henry, though weary, endured. The institutions he had built proved resilient. His legal reforms, his loyal barons, his trained administrators, they all held firm. Victory came, but at a cost. Henry had won the war, but lost something vital. He no longer trusted his own blood. The sons he had once nurtured became threats. The wife he had once loved stood with his enemies. Surrounded by mercenaries, he grew increasingly isolated, watching the world he had built begin to shift beyond his reach. His legal system, intended to secure his rule, now had a life of its own. Laws were interpreted by judges without consulting the king. Rights and customs hardened into expectations. What had once been a means of control began to evolve into a check upon royal authority, a development no king could have entirely foreseen. As age settled upon Henry, so too did the realization that the empire he forged might not survive him intact. The weight of kingship, once carried with vigor, began to crush his spirit, and in the distance, new forces stirred. The Crusades beckoned knights and kings alike with dreams of redemption and martial glory. In the halls of learning, new ideas of governance and justice began to take root, ideas that would, in time, reshape the very concept of monarchy. Henry's final days were marked not by triumph, but by sorrow. In 1189, he died at Chinon Castle, broken-hearted and betrayed. His sons had deserted him. His legacy hung in the balance. His final words, steeped in bitterness, cursed the day of his birth, lament not just for himself, but for the impossible burdens of medieval rule. And then a new king rose. Henry's son, Richard, later called the Lionheart, was a man utterly unlike his father. Where Henry was pragmatic, Richard was poetic. Where Henry sought order, Richard craved glory. Raised in Aquitaine, speaking French more fluently than English, Richard saw the kingdom not as home, but as a source of gold to fund his crusades. And crusade he would. The Holy Land, lost to Saladin, had become an obsession among the nobility of Europe. Richard, like many of his peers, was drawn to Jerusalem not just by piety, but by legend and ambition. The Crusades, once impassioned pleas for spiritual unity, had become grand enterprises of politics and power, faith and fortune. The reign of Henry II had ended, leaving behind a realm transformed and trembling. And now, with Richard's ascension, the great experiment of Angevin rule would face new trials. The next chapter of England's story, its struggles, splendors, and storms, was about to unfold. Let us drift forward into that next chapter, gently, as the echoes of the past guide us into the coming tides of history. In the golden haze of a late 12th century morning, Europe stirred with dreams of sacred conquest. The Holy Land, shimmering beyond distant seas, drew kings like iron to load stone among them. Richard the Lionheart, a king forged in the crucible of chivalry and war. Richard of England would soon embark on a journey that would define his reign and echo across the centuries. Alongside him marched Philip Augustus of France and the aged Emperor Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, 3 monarchs bound by faith, ambition, and rivalry. The Third Crusade, grand in scale, staggering in cost, and titanic in aspiration, marked the pinnacle of the medieval crusading movement. For Richard, its preparations consumed the earliest years of his kingship, And though he inherited an England wealthy and organized from the reforms of his father, Henry II, he also found himself burdened by the delicate machinery of that wealth. The immense cost of the expedition required ingenuity, and thus arose the Saladin tithe, the sweeping tax on all movable goods, a bold innovation in medieval finance. This tithe, though effective, was deeply unpopular. It reached into every corner of society, extracting coin from peasants and nobles alike, illuminating just how ruthlessly the Norman administrative engine could gather wealth. But it also laid bare its vulnerabilities: corruption, abuse, resentment. For all its strength, the system bent under the strain, and the people who bore the weight grumbled beneath it. Before departing for the East, Richard arranged the governance of his kingdom. Yet in doing so, he misread the political tensions his father had spent decades mastering. Power was split between William Longchamp, his loyal chancellor, and his half-brother, Geoffrey. It was a structure that, rather than preserving peace, sowed seeds of discord. While Richard crusaded under the Levantine sun, England teetered on the brink. A brief civil war would reveal the stark truth. For all its institutions and officials, medieval government depended, at its core, on the personal presence of the king. News drifted slowly westward from the Holy Land, tales of sieges and valor carried by sea and song. Richard, it was said, was a master of war cunning, daring, relentless. At the siege of Acre, where Christian and Muslim armies clashed for months in brutal deadlock, he commanded with a precision rarely seen in medieval battle. His siege engines battered the walls. His parley with Saladin was a dance of steel-veiled diplomacy. The conflict was no longer the chaotic maelstrom of earlier times. Warfare had evolved into an art, planned, calculated, devastating. But for all his brilliance, Richard's gains would not endure. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. The fortresses won by sword and blood were fragile, destined to fall. The crusade, though stirring in legend, left behind little of lasting substance save exhaustion and debt. And so, the king who had chased glory found himself trapped, not on the battlefield, but on the road home, captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had slighted during the campaign. Richard became a prisoner of politics. The ransom demanded for his release was astronomical, twice the annual income of the English crown. It was a price not only of coin, but of transformation. To gather such a sum required more than feudal obligation. It demanded consensus and agreement between monarch and realm. For the first time, voices long unheeded were summoned to speak. Landowners, clergy, townsmen, assemblies met. Delegates conferred. And in those urgent gatherings, a subtle shift began. The very notion of government stirred toward something new, a partnership, however uneven, between ruler and ruled. The process of raising Richard's ransom forced the king's ministers to articulate authority in new ways. The people were no longer merely subjects to be taxed. They were participants in decisions, however rudimentary. Rights were discussed, limits were proposed, precedents were made. The path toward parliamentary government, though centuries from fruition, had begun to take shape. By the time Richard returned to England in 1194, his kingdom had changed. The administration he had left behind had proven resilient, but also dangerous. In his absence, corruption had festered. Ambitious barons had grown used to wielding power without oversight, and the common people had tasted the strange idea that their cooperation might matter. The burdens of war and ransom had altered the balance between crown and country. Yet Richard would not linger long in England. His final years were consumed by a bitter war against Philip Augustus of France. The struggle was one of ambition, not righteousness, territory, not faith. No longer did monarchs cloak their conquests in sacred purpose. Where William the Conqueror had claimed a throne under a banner of legitimacy, Richard and Philip fought over scraps of empire with a cynicism that would have startled their ancestors. It was a new age of warfare, strategic, ruthless, unmoored from feudal ideals. The knightly code of chivalry, so central to Richard's persona, stood at odds with the cold calculations of politics. His death, struck down by a crossbow bolt in 1199 while besieging a petty castle, seemed to encapsulate the futility of it all. A warrior king felled over a quarrel whose purpose remains uncertain. He forgave his killer a gesture that resonated with nobility, but his passing changed little. His reign, for all its drama and heroism, left a kingdom strained and uncertain. Into that uneasy vacuum stepped his brother, John. From the beginning, John lacked the charisma that had marked his siblings. Known even in youth as Lackland, he had no great inheritance and little acclaim. His reputation for betrayal, forged during Richard's absence, preceded him, and when he took the throne, suspicion clung to him like a shadow. The early years of John's reign were marked by failure. He inherited not only the crown, but also the crumbling remnants of the Angevin Empire, vast sprawl of lands across France and England, knit together by loyalty and fear. Philip Augustus, ever the opportunist, struck swiftly. Normandy fell in 1204, a staggering blow. The homeland of the Norman dynasty was lost, and with it the confidence of the Anglo-Norman elite. Barons, who had long straddled the Channel, were forced to choose English loyalty or continental wealth. Many lost lands, some lost patience. The ties that had held the nobility together began to fray, and John's rule became increasingly desperate. To fund his struggling government, John turned to new forms of revenue. He imposed harsh forest laws. He extracted feudal dues with unprecedented zeal. Justice became a commodity, sold and withheld at will. The delicate understanding between king and subjects, so carefully maintained by his father, was shattered. Where Henry II had built systems, John built resentment. Tensions escalated further with the Church. A dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury erupted into crisis. The Pope excommunicated John. England, under interdict, found itself spiritually isolated. No masses, no sacraments, a kingdom under divine silence. It was a darkness that touched every village and chapel. Yet even this did not break John's grip. He tightened control, extracted fines, and alienated all who might have stood by him. Barons, bishops, merchants all chafed under his rule, and from this resentment emerged something unprecedented: organized resistance. Led by barons such as Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace de Vesey, the rebellion against John was no mere feud. It was a movement shaped not only by grievances but by ideals, drawing from both English tradition and continental legal thought. They began to question not just the king's behavior, but the very structure of his power. In 1215, at Runnymede, this confrontation reached its climax. There, beneath the summer sky, John was compelled to seal Magna Carta, Charter of Liberties, born not of generosity, but necessity. 63 clauses, each the product of tense negotiation, etched a vision of governance where law stood above whim. Among its provisions, one would echo through ages: that no free man could be imprisoned or dispossessed save by the judgment of his peers or the law of the land. It was a simple idea, justice by process, not decree, but its implications were profound. Yet the ink had barely dried before John repudiated the charter. With papal backing, he claimed it had been signed under duress and was thus void. Civil war followed, bitter and brutal. The barons, in their desperation, invited Louis of France to claim the throne, startling betrayal of their own Norman heritage. The bonds of feudal unity were shattered. In the final years of his reign, England was torn asunder, not merely by swords, but by ideas. The questions raised at Runnymede would never be fully silenced. What limits should bind a king? What rights belong to the governed? And who, in the end, holds the true authority in a realm of crown and custom? These questions, whispered on battlefields and in court halls, would echo through centuries. For though John would die in the midst of war, and though Magna Carta would be annulled and reissued, the principles it embodied had taken root. From them, the long, slow evolution of English liberty would begin. As twilight descended upon the battered stone walls of Rochester Castle, the sounds of clashing steel and the thunderous roar of siege engines filled the dusky air. It was here, in one of the most pivotal confrontations of the early 13th century, that the siege of Rochester became a potent symbol of the fierce resolve with which both crown and barons fought to shape the future of English governance. For weeks, the castle's defenders lined with the rebel cause held out against King John's relentless assault. Amid the uncertainty of civil war, their defiance echoed like a flame refusing to be extinguished. Across the realm, the scars of conflict deepened. Foreign mercenaries, enlisted by both sides, swept through villages and towns, leaving chaos and desolation in their wake. The once familiar rhythms of rural life collapsed into fear and famine. Trade routes withered as roads grew perilous. Lawlessness reigned where local justices once held sway. The land, once fortified by Norman efficiency and Angevin ambition, now teetered on the brink of collapse. It was against this bleak and unraveling backdrop that King John met his end in October of 1216 in the town of Newark. The cause of death remains uncertain. Some say dysentery. Others murmur of poison, but the timing was undeniably significant. John died when his authority was at its nadir. The vast empire he had inherited, stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, had crumbled. What remained was little more than a fractured patch of England, barely held by the tattered Plantagenet crown. His heir, Henry, was just 9 years old, a boy king at the helm of a shattered kingdom. And yet, the regency that gathered around him proved unexpectedly wise and capable. At its head stood Guala, the papal legate, and William Marshal, the venerable knight whose loyalty had served for monarchs. Together, they set about the daunting task of national restoration. The Magna Carta, once wrenched from John's hands by his rebellious barons, was reissued in a revised form. No longer a humiliating concession, it became a symbol of thoughtful reform. Meanwhile, peace overtures to the invading French gained ground. One by one, rebel nobles returned to royal allegiance, drawn not by fear but by the flickering hope of a new beginning. A decisive moment came in 1217 at the Battle of Lincoln. There William Marshal, well into his 70s, led loyalist forces to victory against rebel and French troops. It was a triumph of more than just strategy. It was a victory of belief. Marshall's hard-won experience and unshakable honor held the kingdom together at its most fragile hour. His success preserved the monarchy and safeguarded the legal principles that would one day define the nation. The fragile peace that followed allowed something essential to take root: the quiet reassembly of English institutions. As Henry III's regency continued into the 1220s, royal administration slowly stirred back to life. Foreign alliances were cautiously renewed. Though the wounds of civil war remained, the administrative legacy of the Normans and the Angevins proved surprisingly resilient. By the time Henry assumed full royal powers in 1227, the England he came to rule had been transformed. Gone was the sprawling empire once dreamed of by his great-grandfather, Henry II. King John's failures had severed England's hold on its continental possessions. What remained was an island kingdom smaller, yes, but more unified. And in this more compact realm, the English nobility, no longer distracted by distant holdings, turned their focus inward. From this new orientation, a deeper sense of national identity quietly emerged. The inward gaze gave rise to slow but meaningful change. The pressures of war and taxation had fostered new habits of consultation between king and barons, early threads in the long weave of parliamentary government. Legal reforms, begun in earlier reigns, matured into a more coherent system of common law, steadily replacing patchwork customs. Even in the wake of chaos, English governance had not crumbled, it had adapted. As Henry III began his personal rule, expectations soared. He was known for his piety, his learning, and his refined tastes in art and architecture. His early reign was marked by noble aspirations, yet over time, a gap opened between vision and execution, between princely idealism and the burdens of rule. His most enduring achievement, perhaps, was the reconstruction of Westminster Abbey. Conceived not merely as a church, but as a statement of national purpose, the Abbey rose as a Gothic marvel. Its luminous stained glass, soaring arches, and intricate stonework reflected a refined aesthetic, rivaling Europe's greatest cathedrals. Through its transformation, an ancient Saxon sanctuary was reborn as a monument to English faith and cultural ambition. But grandeur has a cost. To finance his building projects and to support a growing circle of foreign relatives and favored courtiers, Henry levied taxes that strained his kingdom. The very qualities that made him endearing, his generosity, his cosmopolitan charm, his passion for beauty, also left him politically exposed. Discontent grew, especially among barons excluded from royal favor. They began to demand more than consultation. They demanded control. Their answer came in 1258 with the Provisions of Oxford. More than a rebellion, it was a bid to reshape monarchy itself. A council of 15 barons was appointed to guide royal policy, and regular parliaments were promised to ensure accountability. The king was no longer expected to rule alone. It was an extraordinary shifting, embryonic constitutional monarchy emerging centuries before the idea would become mainstream. But it also introduced a lingering dilemma: how to balance decisive leadership with collective oversight. Could governance by many still move swiftly in times of crisis? Could a king bound by counsel still wield authority? As these tensions escalated, theory gave way to conflict. When Henry sought to undo the provisions and reclaim full power, civil war erupted again. This time, its center was Simon de Montfort. Born into French nobility, de Montfort had married into the English royal family and once enjoyed the king's trust. But growing disillusionment led him from court favorite to reformist champion. He insisted that power must be shared, that the realm, not just the monarch, should steer the kingdom's course. In 1264, at the Battle of Lewes, de Montfort's forces defeated the royal army and took both Henry and his son, Edward, prisoner. For a brief, brilliant moment, the idea of shared governance eclipsed the authority of the crown. In January 1265, de Montfort summoned a groundbreaking parliament. Unlike previous councils, this one included not only nobles and bishops, but also representatives from towns and shires. For the first time, the voices of the commons were heard in national deliberation. It was a modest beginning, but one whose significance would echo across the centuries as the House of Commons slowly took shape. Yet de Montfort's bold experiment was short-lived. In his zeal for reform, he alienated allies and overstepped limits. He used foreign troops to secure power and manipulated the very structures he had promised to uphold. In his quest to restrain monarchy, he flirted with tyranny. The reaction was swift. At the Battle of Evesham in August 1265, Prince Edward, soon to become Edward I, led royalist forces to a crushing victory. De Montfort was slain on the field, his body dismembered in grim symbolism. The revolution he championed seemed extinguished. Yet the kingdom did not return to its old absolutism. Instead, it found a cautious balance. The Dictum of Kenilworth, issued in 1266, offered rebels the chance to redeem themselves by paying fines and pledging loyalty. The crown, though victorious, accepted boundaries. Both sides had learned that compromise offered more than conquest. When Edward I ascended the throne in 1272, he brought with him a legacy shaped by both war and reform. Battle-tested and politically astute, Edward would steer England into a new chapter, one marked by strength, law, and careful evolution. His military campaigns in Wales and Scotland, his comprehensive legal reforms, and his regular summoning of representative parliaments forged a monarchy that was at once powerful and increasingly responsive. Under Edward, the crown did not retreat from its authority, but it learned to govern in dialogue with the nation. And so, through rebellion and reconciliation, defeat and recovery, England continued its slow transformation. No longer a sprawling continental empire, it became a kingdom defined by law, shaped by shared power, and enriched by an emerging sense of national identity. The questions first asked in the time of Magna Carta about the nature of kingship, the limits of authority, and the rights of subjects remained open. They are questions that would echo across the centuries, guiding England's long journey through the corridors of power and the chambers of parliaments, seeking always, in darkness and in light, the meaning of sovereignty and the shape of freedom. The wars in Wales that marked the early decades of Edward I's reign were far more than brutal contests of arms. They were, in truth, sweeping campaigns of cultural domination, carefully designed exercises in transforming the very shape of the Celtic frontier. The mighty fortresses that Edward raised across the Welsh landscape at Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris stood not merely as walls of defense, but as cold and immovable symbols of English supremacy. Their towering curtain walls and concentric defenses whispered of conquest, but also permanence. They were built to dazzle, to intimidate, to remind the Welsh not just of defeat, but of their new place in the world. In the wake of these castles came a system of governance, as foreign as the stone walls themselves. English law was imposed. English officials took command. Bit by bit, the old Celtic customs, passed down through centuries of oral tradition and native practice, were pushed aside. In their place came a new order, colder, more bureaucratic, less rooted in the soil. What Edward forged in Wales was not merely victory, it was transformation, the slow but relentless erosion of identity beneath the weight of empire. Yet, if Wales had bowed under the pressure of military and administrative might, Scotland would not. The northern kingdom, rugged and proud, offered resistance, fiercer and far more enduring. In 1286, the death of Alexander III plunged Scotland into uncertainty. The ensuing crisis, ripe for exploitations, seemed to promise Edward an opportunity to extend his power northward with ease. As overlord, he would arbitrate among rival claimants to the throne, drawing Scotland quietly into his fold. But Scotland did not yield quietly. The nobility resisted, the land stirred. When William Wallace rose in defiance, it was not merely an act of rebellion, it was the voice of a nation unwilling to be annexed. Though Wallace's own story would end in chains, his legend endured, inspiring others to rise in his stead, chief among them Robert the Bruce. The wars that followed, climaxing at Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn Wood, enshrined Scotland's identity and lay bare the limits of Edward's power. Conquest, it turned out, was not the same as control. Beyond his military ambitions, Edward's reign is remembered for something deeper, a legacy of legal reform that would shape England for centuries to come. Through a series of statutes carefully drafted, thoughtfully implemented, Edward sought to bring coherence to a legal system that had evolved haphazardly over 2 centuries. The statutes of Westminster, Mortmain, and Quia Emptors may seem dry to modern ears, but in their time they were bold and deliberate instruments of order. Each statute addressed a particular flaw in the common law, be it land tenure, ecclesiastical privilege, or feudal custom, but together they represented something more, an attempt to bind the kingdom together with a consistent legal framework. Edward was called the English Justinian, not without reason. His laws would form the bedrock of English jurisprudence, their influence extending far beyond his reign, far beyond his kingdom, to the very heart of the English-speaking world. In tandem with this legal evolution came a parallel development in governance. The institutions of Parliament, once irregular and ad hoc, were beginning to take firmer root. Though Edward summoned assemblies out of necessity rather than democratic idealism, the results were nevertheless profound. The famous Model Parliament of 1295 brought together nobles, clergy, and commons in a structure that resembled something startlingly modern. It was, in many ways, an early template for representative government. This expansion of parliamentary life was driven, in part, by the king's need for money. Wars against the Welsh, against the Scots, and on the continent were expensive. Diplomacy cost dearly. Administration grew heavier. No longer could a king finance his realm through traditional means. He now required taxes, and for taxes he required consent. Thus Parliament, summoned first as a means of approval, slowly began to assert itself as a check upon royal authority. The financial reality of Edward's reign placed England in lockstep with the rhythms of the wider European economy. Italian bankers became vital to the crown's solvency. Merchant guilds, especially those trading in wool, grew in prominence. Commercial duties, import levies, and foreign loans became the instruments of statecraft. England was no longer isolated. It was now woven into the economic tapestry of Europe. One of the more somber echoes of this transformation was the expulsion of the Jews in 1290. For centuries, Jewish communities had played a critical role in English finance, especially in money lending, a trade from which Christians were largely barred. But centuries of suspicion, scapegoating, and religious prejudice had taken their toll. The crown, facing mounting debts and seeking popularity, chose expulsion. The loss was profound. A vibrant, essential community was erased from English life. And yet, in the aftermath, the vacuum was filled. English merchants adapted. New credit systems arose. The commercial revolution continued. Amid these political and economic changes, the culture of Edward's England blossomed. This was an age not just of warriors and laws, but of cathedrals and chronicles. Across the kingdom, Gothic spires pierced the sky. Great stone churches rose in reverent defiance of time. Within their walls, illuminated manuscripts glowed with sacred color. Monastic scribes worked by candlelight, preserving memory and myth alike. A new voice emerged in the vernacular. As English once, the language of peasants began to rise alongside Latin in poetry, prayer, and proclamation. It was an age of thinkers and chroniclers. Bracton's treatises shaped legal understanding. Matthew Paris's vivid histories captured the drama of the age. Architects, those anonymous masters of light and stone transformed cities with towers and arches that seemed to touch heaven itself. In culture, as in power, England stood shoulder to shoulder with the great kingdoms of Europe. When Edward died in 1307, the kingdom mourned. His reign had been long, his presence formidable. He left behind a realm enlarged, a government strengthened, a law more coherent than ever before. But with his death came uncertainty. The foundation was laid, yes, but would it hold? To his son, Edward II, fell the burden of proving it. But the younger Edward was not his father. The iron determination that had conquered Wales, the shrewd intellect that had woven law and governance into a lasting legacy, these gifts were not inherited. Instead, England now had a king more inclined toward personal loyalty than public leadership. A man of gentle sensibilities and private affections, Edward II failed to inspire either fear or respect. At the center of early controversy stood Piers Gaveston, Gascon knight of elegant manners and unshakable confidence, who had been Edward's closest companion since youth. Upon his ascension, the new king elevated Gaveston to titles and offices that scandalized the nobility. Their resentment, however, was not only about affection, it was about power. Gaveston wielded it indiscriminately. Together, he and the king mocked the barons, scorned tradition, and governed through whim rather than counsel. The nobility, hardened by decades of constitutional evolution, would not stand idly by. In 1311, they imposed the ordinances, a series of reforms meant to curtail royal excess and reassert baronial influence. Echoing the old provisions of Oxford from the reign of Henry III, these ordinances demanded accountability. The royal household was to be reformed. Appointments were to be approved. Gaveston was to be exiled. And yet, despite these limitations, the deeper tragedy of Edward II's reign was not defiance, but failure. He lacked the ability to lead, even when afforded the opportunity. Under his command, the wars in Scotland fell into chaos. What had once seemed nearly won disintegrated. In 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce shattered the English army. It was not merely a loss, it was a humiliation, one that reverberated for generations. The financial consequences were immediate. Forced to summon Parliament more frequently than any of his predecessors, Edward unwittingly accelerated the transformation of governance. No longer content to rubber-stamp taxation, the commons began to present petitions, to demand accountability, to insist that their voice mattered. What had begun as a royal necessity now edged toward a constitutional expectation. As the king floundered, others stepped forward. Chief among them was Thomas of Lancaster, cousin to the king and, for a time, the most powerful man in England. His rise marked the increasing influence of baronial power but also its limits. For the struggle that followed would test not only men, but the very structure of medieval kingship. The king's cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, ruled vast swaths of land in the north, and wielded the loyalty of powerful nobles. With wealth, lineage, and influence at his command, he seemed the only man who might reign in royal excess. Yet, when Lancaster assumed control, his governance proved no better. His leadership, arbitrary and ineffective, mirrored the very failings he had decried in Edward II. And so, it became clear, the rot lay not only in rulers, but in the structures that bound them. The problems of governance in medieval England ran deeper than any one man. In 1312, a moment of brutal reckoning arrived. Piers Gaveston, Edward's beloved companion, had long been a thorn in the side of the nobility. His arrogance, influence, and favoritism had roused enduring resentment. When he was seized under a banner of safe conduct and executed without trial, it was not merely an act of vengeance, it was a dark turning point. The brutal death, carried out by barons weary of restraint, exposed a bitter truth. The rule of law in England was fragile, and personal vendettas could still eclipse institutional order. This trauma carved a deep wound in Edward's heart. No longer simply ineffectual, the king grew hardened, a man now consumed by wrath and the desire for revenge. Civil war soon followed, as Edward turned his fury upon Lancaster and the coalition that had once checked his will. The realm fractured, revealing how utterly the old unity of the nobility had unraveled. At Boroughbridge in 1322, Edward's forces triumphed. Lancaster was captured and summarily executed. Royal authority, for a moment, stood tall again, but the king's methods had been merciless, dismissing justice, ignoring due process, and trampling the very laws he had sworn to uphold. These actions, while temporarily triumphant, would set precedents that darkened the future of the monarchy. Into this power vacuum stepped a new figure, Hugh Despenser the Younger, Edward's latest favorite. But where Gaveston had been vain and reckless, Despenser was cunning and dangerous. He grasped power with both hands, accumulating wealth and titles at a breathtaking pace. He disregarded custom, twisted legal norms, and terrorized rivals. Under his influence, favoritism became tyranny, and the kingdom once more slid toward chaos. In 1326, salvation came, or so it seemed. Queen Isabella, spurned and humiliated by her husband's open preference for male companions, joined forces with Roger Mortimer, a baron who had escaped imprisonment and sought refuge in France. Together, they orchestrated an invasion, not simply a rebellion, but a revolution. Their cause attracted more than just disaffected lords. Merchants, townspeople, and common folk rallied to them, wearied by years of misrule. So swift was the collapse of Edward's regime that it startled the kingdom. Once the richest monarch in Europe, Edward now found himself deserted, pursued by his subjects, betrayed by his allies, and reduced to hiding in his own land. In November of 1326, Edward and the Despensers were captured at Neath Abbey. The reign that had begun with promise ended in disgrace. Yet this downfall posed new and unsettling questions. What was a king, if not sacred? Could he be removed, and by whom? In January 1327, Edward II was deposed, a moment unprecedented in English law. A parliament was summoned, not just of lords and clergy, but of commons too, forming a body that claimed to speak for the entire nation. Articles of accusation were read. Allegiance was formally withdrawn, and Edward's young son, just 14, was crowned Edward III. This moment marked the birth of a constitutional precedent, one that would echo across generations. A king could fall, not by sword alone, but by a gathering of voices, by formal renunciation, by law. Yet even the loftiest procedures could not silence the darker truths of power. In September 1327, Edward II met a gruesome end at Berkeley Castle. His murder, ordered by Mortimer, with Isabella's likely assent, was cloaked in secrecy. The method, a red-hot poker, inserted to leave no visible wound, was a symbol as much as a crime. The king, who had flouted custom and embraced unnatural affections, they claimed, met a punishment equally unnatural. Behind the horror was a message. Kings who lost their mandate could meet not only deposition, but annihilation. The regency that followed, with Isabella and Mortimer ruling in young Edward III's name, proved a disillusionment. Far from offering renewal, it echoed the corruption of the dispensers. Wealth was hoarded, reforms ignored, and tyranny once again took root. The Queen Mother and her lover seemed no more just than the fallen king. Their failures drove home a sobering lesson. England's malaise ran deeper than any single tyrant. In 1330, Edward III, now 17, acted in a daring coup at Nottingham Castle. He seized Mortimer and asserted his rule. Mortimer was executed. Isabella, though spared, was banished from power. And with that, the true reign of Edward III began. One of the most dazzling in England's medieval history, the young king, shaped by years of turmoil, possessed both strategic brilliance and political finesse. Under his leadership, the kingdom would blossom, not only in arms, but in culture, governance, and pride. His first great test came in 1333 at Halidon Hill. There, English forces crushed a Scottish army, reclaiming dominance in the north. The tactics Edward employed were bold and new. Knights fought dismounted alongside skilled archers, whose longbows rained death with terrifying efficiency. This fusion of strength and range would change the face of European warfare. It was the first gleam of England's military ascendancy. Then, in 1337, Edward III pressed a bold claim, the French crown itself. Through his mother, Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France, Edward asserted his right to rule across the Channel. This was no mere dynastic squabble. It was a struggle for control of Europe's political and economic lifelines, the wool trade, the wine routes, the bustling ports. And so the 100 Years' War began. In 1346, near the village of Edward III, delivered one of England's greatest victories. The English army, well positioned and expertly led, devastated the French chivalry. Wave after wave of mounted knights fell before the withering power of the longbow. Among the fallen was John of Bohemia, blind but determined to fight. He had his horse tied to others and rode into battle to strike a single blow before death claimed him. His end was tragic and noble, a farewell to an age of gallant but doomed heroism. Yet war is more than battles. Strategy matters too. Edward turned next to Calais, a vital port, gateway to the continent. The siege lasted a year. The city starved. Its people broke. In a moment of heart-wrenching drama, 6 leading citizens, the burghers of Calais, offered themselves to save their fellows, presenting themselves barefoot and in chains. Their act, and Edward's eventual mercy, entered legend. When Calais fell, it became a symbol, a foothold for future English campaigns, a statement of enduring power. But no army, no king, no city could withstand what came next. In 1348, the plague arrived. The Black Death swept through England with an invisible scythe, sparing no town, no class, no age. Born in the East, carried by trade, it struck with unfathomable speed. Perhaps a third of the population perished. Fields went untended. Churches fell silent. Villages disappeared. The very fabric of society unraveled. And in that unraveling, strange new forces emerged. With so many dead, labor was scarce. Survivors demanded and received better wages. For the first time, peasants glimpsed mobility. The rigid bonds of feudalism cracked. Parliament responded with the Statute of Laborers in 1351, an attempt to freeze wages and restore the old order. But history cannot be reversed. The plague had done more than kill. It had transformed. The old world was gone, and in its place something new, uncertain, raw, but brimming with change, began to stir. The fires of war, long dimmed by pestilence and hardship, flared once more in the 1350s, the 100 Years' War. Dormant during the ravages of the Black Death, returned like a familiar spectre to the fields of France. And for King Edward III of England, this resurgence offered not dread, but opportunity, a chance to prove that English might had not perished in the plague's long shadow. It was in 1356, near the town of Poitiers, that the English cause found its vindication. There, Edward's son, the famed Black Prince, led his troops into battle with calm ferocity. The French king, John II, fell into English hands, a sovereign captured on the field, his nobles broken, his army scattered. The victory was not merely martial, it was symbolic. The tactics that had triumphed, the careful use of terrain, the measured discipline had proven themselves again with devastating precision. From this conquest came riches, not only in gold, but in prestige. The ransom for the captive king was immense. With it, England financed new campaigns, gilded cathedrals, commissioned tapestries, and declared its power with the soaring spires of stone and sound. The treaty of signed in 1360 seemed to seal England's moment of glory. In exchange for relinquishing his claim to the French throne, Edward III received not only gold, but sovereignty over vast swaths of land, Aquitaine and Calais among them. On parchment, at least, the treaty proclaimed triumph. But peace, soldiers once made wealthy through plunder, found themselves adrift. Without war, there were no ransoms, no spoils, no cause for glory. These men, trained in violence, were restless. Some turned to mercenary work, others to crime. Meanwhile, the English administration faced an even heavier challenge: how to rule and maintain these distant continental territories, how to govern in peace what had once been taken in war. These were tests not of swords, but of parchment, policy, and patience. By 1376, the twilight of Edward III's reign had come, and with it, the gathering of what history would call the Good Parliament. This assembly revealed just how much had changed since the early years of his rule. The Commons, once a secondary voice, now stepped forward with assertive clarity. Having borne the financial weight of England's wars, They demanded accountability. They impeached corrupt royal officers. They insisted on proper oversight of the king's expenditures. And above all, they laid the groundwork for a profound transformation, that taxation could only proceed with genuine consent from Parliament. The system of English governance, still medieval in form, was beginning to stretch toward something new. But even as these seeds of constitutionalism were sown, a great chapter was closing. In 1376, the Black Prince, long considered the heir of England's future, died. 1 year later, the old king himself followed. Edward III, warrior, builder, lawgiver, passed into legend, and in his place rose a child. The boy king, Richard II, just 10 years of age, ascended the throne in 1377. Around him, a court of powerful barons vied for influence, each eager to guide or control the crown. The kingdom he inherited was no longer a simple feudal land of knights and lords. It was a society reshaped by plague, by war, and by new ideas about governance. The very institutions built by Edward III now stood at a crossroads, tested by the uncertainty of youth and the burdens of change. It was during these early years that England trembled anew. In 1381, a spark lit the countryside aflame. The Peasants' Revolt, one of the most extraordinary uprisings in English history, erupted in fury. The cause was not simply the infamous poll tax, though that levy was the immediate trigger. Rather, it was a rising tide of frustration, stirred by decades of hardship and exploitation. The survivors of the Black Death had come to realize their worth, had come to expect Morand. The old order had no answers to give. Led by men like Watt, Tyler, and John Ball, the rebels marched on London with dreams that reached beyond tax reform. They called for the abolition of serfdom, for a fairer distribution of wealth, for a society in which birth alone no longer dictated destiny. Their vision was radical, and their courage undeniable. It was at Smithfield, on the outskirts of the capital, that the most dramatic moment of Richard's early reign unfolded. There, the young king, just 14, rode out to meet the rebels himself. He spoke with them face to face, promising reform, offering sympathy, calming the storm. In that moment, he was more than a boy. He was a monarch in the fullest sense, decisive, daring, and composed. Yet, what followed betrayed the hope that had flickered in those tense hours. The king's promises were rescinded. The rebels were hunted down. Wat Tyler was killed. John Ball was executed. The vision of a more equal England was crushed beneath the weight of royal retribution. The old order, though shaken, had endured. And so, Richard II entered adulthood under a shadow of rebellion, of expectation, of a society still searching for its future. In many ways, his reign seemed poised to fulfill the constitutional revolution that had begun long before his birth. He was intelligent, well-educated, charismatic, possessed of a theatrical flair that made him beloved by some and feared by others. His court blossomed with culture. Poets like Geoffrey Chaucer gave voice to a growing English identity, crafting verses that celebrated all walks of life, from knight to plowman. At the same time, the splendor of Richard's court, its pageantry, its ceremony, its Gothic beauty, stood as a testament to a nation increasingly confident in its sophistication. England, once seen as peripheral to the great kingdoms of Europe, was becoming a center of art, architecture, and political thought. But beneath the gilded surface, unrest stirred. The war with France dragged on. The plague returned in waves. Reformers like John Wycliffe questioned the Church. challenging spiritual and political hierarchies alike. And Parliament, once a partner of the crown, now began to flex its authority with renewed determination. In 1387, this tension reached a crisis point. A group of nobles, known as the Lords Appellant, rose in defiance of Richard's inner circle. They claimed not to oppose the king himself, but rather his councillors-men they deemed corrupt, self-serving, and unworthy of influence. Backed by Parliament and legal precedent, they stripped the king of power, executed his allies, and forced him into humiliating submission. What followed, in 1388, came to be known as the Merciless Parliament, an apt name for the severity it displayed. Here, the machinery of constitutional government turned against the monarchy itself. The lessons of the past, the impeachment powers, the taxation controls, the accountability measures were now used not to bolster the crown, but to restrain it. For Richard, the memory of this disgrace would never fade. In the years that followed, he played a long and dangerous game. He rebuilt his authority, piece by piece, cloaking his intentions beneath the veneer of lawful rule. He surrounded himself with loyalists, cultivated a personal court that answered to him alone, and gradually reclaimed the power that had been taken from him. By the 1390s, Richard ruled with quiet precision and growing ruthlessness. He used the court of chivalry to bypass traditional justice. He forced subjects to sign blank charters, used loans as veiled coercion, and governed increasingly by decree. All the while, he maintained the outer forms of constitutional governance, even as he hollowed out their substance. His rule became a paradox, legal on the surface, authoritarian at its core. And then, in 1399, the storm broke. Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Lancaster and cousin to the king, returned from exile. Whether his aim was justice, revenge, or power, we cannot say. What we do know is that his return unleashed a chain of events that would upend the monarchy. Richard was captured and deposed not by force alone, but through carefully staged parliamentary proceedings. The transfer of power, though it emerged from rebellion, wore the robes of legality. Henry was crowned Henry IV, not merely by the sword, but by the will of Parliament. This was no ordinary succession. It was a constitutional reckoning. The divine right of king's law, considered sacred, had been weighed against the authority of law and found wanting. The monarchy, for all its splendor, had been made subject to the people's voice. Yet for Henry, the crown was not a prize but a burden. His reign began with the challenge of legitimacy. His rule was shadowed by unrest, rebellion, and suspicion. For though he wore the crown, he knew, as did the kingdom, that it had been won in revolution. And thus a new age dawned, uncertain, uneasy, but undeniably changed. The institutions born in the high medieval world had been tested, strained, reshaped. The English people had glimpsed the power of their own voice, and the monarchy, once above all, now stood entwined in the hands of Parliament, precedent, and public will. The story continues, softly, steadily, into the next chapter of England's long and restless dream. The crown, once seized in fire and fury by Henry IV, proved more a burden than a blessing. From the moment he claimed it, rebellions shadowed his reign. In the mountains of Wales, Owain Glyndwr raised the dragon standard in a dream of independence, while to the north, the mighty Percy's Rostwile allies turned adversaries' rose in defiance of the king they had helped enthrone. These uprisings were more than regional discord. They were expressions of a deeper unrest, born of a kingdom uneasy with the legitimacy of its sovereign. For though Henry had promised reform, had spoken the language of consent and counsel. He ruled by the sword and depended, as no king before him, on the favor of Parliament. Royal authority no longer flowed unchecked. It moved only with the current of parliamentary will. The Commons, emboldened by their role in sanctioning the new dynasty, grew more assertive. Once merely a gathering of lesser voices, they now claimed the right to influence royal policy. What had begun as a principle that taxation required consent blossomed into something larger. The idea that no major decision of government could proceed without Parliament's approval. When Henry V ascended the throne in 1413, a new spirit swept through the court. The young king, shaped in the crucible of civil war and raised amid the intricacies of statecraft, brought with him the vigor of youth and the clarity of purpose. The shadow of rebellion faded, replaced by the gleam of national ambition. Like Edward III before him, Henry looked across the Channel. France, long divided and weakened by internal strife, offered both a target and a cause. The ancient Plantagenet claim to the French throne was revived, now tempered by political necessity and driven by personal resolve. In 1415, this claim found its reckoning on the fields near a village called Agincourt. There, amid mud and mist, Henry led a tired and outnumbered army to one of the most iconic victories in English memory. The Battle of Agincourt became more than a military triumph. It was myth, forged in arrow flight and armored clash. English longbowmen, standing firm against the charge of French knights, turned the tide of history. The king himself, sharing danger with his men, became the embodiment of national unity and martial grace. That day, the flower of French chivalry fell, and with them fell the illusion that England's glory belonged only to the past. A legend was born of unbreakable archers, of noble grit, of divine favor shining through English steel. The conquest of Normandy that followed was no reckless raid. It was a carefully administered campaign. Henry did not merely seize, he governed. Castles were taken one by one. Garrisons were established with order. A network of administration spread through the duchy, extracting resources, managing loyalty, and weaving English law into Norman soil. The mistakes of previous campaigns were not repeated. This time, England came not as a raider, but as a ruler. Then, in 1420, came the Treaty of Troyes. France, weakened and divided, agreed to recognize Henry as heir to the French throne. He married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king, and stood on the cusp of uniting two kingdoms long at war. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that the centuries-old English dream of dominion across the Channel would be realized. But triumph carries within it the seeds of tragedy. In 1422, with France and England united in name, if not in heart, Henry V died suddenly, young, victorious, and irreplaceable. In his place rose an infant son, Henry VI, a child too small to wield a sword or steer a kingdom. And so began the long, faltering regency, a government of guardians, not kings. The realm was managed by councils and protectors, each grappling with the impossible task of ruling to lands with different tongues, loyalties, and needs. The nobility, enriched by war, had little appetite for peace, and the ambitions of France refused to sleep. The French, once broken, now found inspiration. In 1429, a young woman, Jeanne d'Arc, rose from the peasant fields with visions of saints and the voice of destiny. Under her banner, the tide turned. At the Battle of Patay, French forces shattered the myth of English invincibility. Orleans, long besieged, was freed, and in the Cathedral of Reims, the Dauphin was crowned Charles VII, King of France. The English foothold on the continent began to crumble. One by one, the hard-won castles of Normandy fell. Garrisons were overrun, loyalties shifted, and the great prize of the Lancastrian dream slipped through England's grasp. By the 1450s, all that remained was the coastal outpost of Calais, final relic of what had once been a continental empire. Yet the loss of land was not the only cost. The returning soldiers brought back more than scars and stories. They carried ideas of merit over birth, of kings who had fled, and of commanders who had failed. The old social hierarchies, already shaken by plague and war, began to crack further. Men who had once fought for crown and country now questioned the world they returned to. Worse still, the king himself, Henry VI, grew unwell. His mind, never strong, began to falter entirely. At times, he lapsed into silence, unable to speak or understand. At others, he wandered in dazed contemplation, far from the matters of state. He believed in the divine right of kings, yet could not perform even the simplest duties of rule. Into this vacuum stepped the great lords of England, each eager to guide or control the fading monarch. Factionalism grew like ivy on a crumbling wall. The Dukes of York and Somerset, of Warwick and Buckingham, turned court into a battlefield of whispered intrigues and shifting alliances. In 1455, the first open conflict erupted at St. Albans. The Duke of York, claiming to defend the kingdom from misrule, led an army against the king's forces and captured Henry himself. Thus began a conflict not just of dynasties, but of ideas of what it meant to be king and who had the right to rule. These were the Wars of the Roses, 30 years of intermittent civil war that would drown the land in blood. Lancastrians, marked by the red rose, clung to the legitimacy of descent. Yorkists, with their white rose, claimed right through competence and consent. The battles were fierce and often personal. Families were split. Nobles changed sides with the turning of the wind. And at the heart of it all stood the broken figure of Henry VI, king too gentle for his age, too devout for power, and ultimately too feeble to hold his throne. In 1461, the tide turned. Edward, Duke of York, claimed the crown as Edward IV, tall, charismatic, and battle-hardened. He embodied a new kind of king, one who drew his authority not only from blood, but from victory. His coronation was not merely a shift in names, but a reaffirmation of the precedent set in 1399, that a king who failed his kingdom could be unseated. Edward's reign was marked by a careful balance of strength and sophistication. He reformed the machinery of government, streamlined administration, and encouraged trade. His court flourished with art, learning, and the beginnings of Renaissance influence. He understood that peace was not merely the absence of war, but the presence of order. Yet even Edward's rule was not immune to turbulence. In 1470, the crown slipped again. Through betrayal and rebellion, Henry VI was briefly restored. An old king returned to a kingdom that no longer knew him. His second reign was a hollow echo, lasting only months before Edward reclaimed the throne in 1471 at the bloody battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury. There, the final hope of the Lancastrians was extinguished. The last of Henry's heirs were slain. The king himself, imprisoned in the Tower of London, met a quiet and sorrowful and likely murdered to seal the Yorkist claim beyond dispute. The Wars of the Roses had not just changed the monarchy, they had stripped it bare. The old sanctity of kingship once protected by divine aura and unspoken tradition, had been tested and broken. No longer could a monarch rule by right alone. Legitimacy now required the consent, if not of the people, then at least of those powerful enough to resist. Edward IV, restored and triumphant, emerged as a king for a changed world. His governance was pragmatic, his vision rooted in stability. He expanded the authority of the crown, developed new forms of revenue, and rebuilt the trust of a weary nation. His reign marked not just the end of civil war, but the twilight of the medieval age. The throne, once a sacred inheritance, had become something more fragile, more contested, an institution that could be won, lost, and redefined. The next dawn would bring new challenges, new dynasties, and a kingdom on the edge of even greater transformation. The reign of Henry IV had never been free from unrest. From the fiery rebellion of Owain Glyndwr in the hills of Wales to the defiant uprisings of the Percy family in the north, his rule was troubled by echoes of discontent. Each of these insurrections drew strength from a quiet, smoldering truth that the Lancastrian claim to the throne was built on uneasy foundations. Henry's crown, seized in a tempest of revolution, bore the weight of legitimacy questioned, and beneath its golden surface, cracks had already begun to show. The realm's finances teetered, revealing just how far the balance of power had shifted. Once, kings ruled with unquestioned might. Now, Henry found himself dependent on Parliament, not merely for support, but for survival. The promises of constitutional reform that had gilded his rise soon became chains. The Commons, emboldened by their role in crowning a new dynasty, grew assertive. They no longer simply granted taxes, they expected a voice in policy, a role in governance. The ancient principle that no tax could be levied without consent began to bloom into something deeper. That Parliament itself should approve all great decisions of the realm. When Henry V ascended the throne in 1413, hope was reborn. A warrior in spirit and in training, the young king had spent his youth immersed in the arts of both government and war. And now, with steady resolve, he sought not only to secure his throne, but to restore England's fading glory. His gaze turned across the Channel to old claims and long-forgotten causes, and he resolved to renew the war with France. The French campaign gave England what it desperately needed, a common cause. It was in those muddy fields that the nation would once again unite. And it was there, Agincourt, in 1415, that legend was born. Henry's outnumbered army, drawn from every shire and county, stood firm against a vast French host. With rain-soaked fields and low-hung skies above, the English longbow sang once more. The French knights, armored and proud, charged, but the arrow-storm broke them. And through discipline, innovation, and divine favor, the English won a victory that would echo for centuries. That moment where the king fought beside common men, where longbowmen stood shoulder to shoulder and refused to yield, became more than just history. It became myth. The Battle of Agincourt was not merely a triumph of arms, but of spirit, a symbol of English resolve. It captured the imagination of poets and patriots alike. But Henry V was more than a conqueror. He was a statesman. The campaign that followed his methodical conquest of Normandy proved that. With measured force and quiet resolve, he reduced stronghold after stronghold, established garrisons, and created systems of governance that could rule and extract, pacify and prosper. The English crown, it seemed, had at last learned how to rule across the sea. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes seemed to bring dreams to life. Henry was recognized as heir to the French throne. The old dynastic ambitions, long frustrated and deferred, now felt within reach. But fate, as it so often does, intervened. Henry died in 1422, his triumphs incomplete, his crown passed not to a man of war, but to an infant, son Henry VI. The burden placed upon that child was too great. 2 kingdoms, England and France, needed governing. Nobles who had grown rich from conquest grew restless in peace, and those who now ruled in the name of the young king lacked the authority to unify a divided realm. Without Henry V's commanding presence, the English hold on France began to slip. The French resurgence came not just through strength of arms, but through spirit. In 1429, the Battle of Plantagenet, by the inspired figure of Joan of Arc, shattered the English advance. Her faith, her courage, and her charisma galvanized a nation. The tide turned. One by one, English strongholds fell. The coronation of the Dauphin in Reims and the lifting of the siege marked the rebirth of French power. As the war dragged on, the returning soldiers brought more than tales of defeat. They carried new ideas of authority, of government, of justice. Veterans who had once lived by the sword now found no place in a land at peace. Nobles returned from France found their experience of little value in the intrigues of court, and those common men who had seen the highborn, abandoned battlefields began to question the rigid hierarchies that had always governed their lives. Then, in the 1450s, came another shadow. Henry VI, grown to manhood, proved gentle, devout, and deeply unfit to rule. Prone to illness, both of the body and the mind, he could not lead. The kingdom, bereft of clear direction, began to fracture. Factions arose, each seeking control. And from these rivalries, civil war emerged. The Wars of the Roses had begun. In 1455, at the Battle of St. Albans, the Duke of York's forces captured the king. The throne, once the seat of unquestioned majesty, now became a prize to be won on the battlefield. For 30 years, England would bleed not for conquest abroad, but for power at home. These were not mere battles of bloodlines. They were struggles between visions of kingship itself. The Lancastrians held fast to divine right, the Yorkists to the idea that legitimacy must be proven by strength and supported by consent. In 1461, Edward IV seized the throne, young, bold, and unafraid to use force to secure peace. His reign brought reformed new financial systems, patronage of the arts, and a vision of monarchy adapted to a changing world. But the old world was not yet done. In 1470, Henry VI was briefly restored. In 1471, he fell again. The Battle of Tewkesbury shattered the last Lancastrian hopes, and soon after, Henry himself was murdered in the Tower. One by one, rival claimants were eliminated. The old ways of dynastic balance gave way to brutal certainty. The Wars of the Roses had claimed a generation and remade the monarchy. Edward IV's return marked the beginning of a new age. War had taught him statecraft. He expanded royal power, built stronger institutions, and brought a measure of peace. But in 1483, he died. His young son, Edward V, succeeded him briefly, before vanishing into the shadows of the Tower, and into that vacuum stepped Richard III, his usurpation justified by claims that Edward's children were illegitimate, was the final act of a kingdom weary of uncertainty. But Richard's reign was brief and bloodied. In 1485, Henry Tudor landed with his army at Bosworth Field amid dust and steel. The last Plantagenet king died with sword in hand, and with his fall, the medieval age passed into history. Now, as we leave behind those winding centuries, we can trace the path that led from chaos to kingdom, from feudal bonds to national identity. From the ashes of Rome rose the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. From the waves came the Normans, reshaping law and land. From Eleanor and Henry II emerged an empire. From barons and kings, a constitution. From cathedrals and courts, a culture. And through war so much, war came a nation unlike any before. The England that Henry VIII would inherit in 1485 was not the realm of William the Conqueror or Henry III. It was something new, a unified state with institutions rooted in custom and law, with a language forged from conquest and compromise, and with a sense of purpose that would stretch far beyond its shores. Its parliament, once a gathering of lords and councillors, would become the model for democracy itself. Its laws, drawn from Saxon custom and Norman command, would shape the world. Its language, layered with Latin, French, and Germanic tones, would carry poetry, philosophy, and the dreams of millions. The story of medieval England is not only the tale of kings and knights, it is the story of common people, ploughmen and merchants, soldiers and scholars, who through their labor and loyalty built a civilization. They stood in the fields of Agincourt. They tilled the soil in peace and held the line in war. They prayed in churches, argued in markets, and passed down a legacy of law, liberty, and resilience. And so, as you drift into the gentle realm of sleep, remember this: the world we know was born from these distant days, not from myth, but from the choices and courage of real people. The rights we enjoy, the justice we seek, the order we trust, they all grew from the foundations laid in centuries of struggle. The medieval age may be gone, but its legacy endures. Through quiet echoes in the halls of Parliament, through the rhythm of the common law, through the poetry of Chaucer, the solemn stones of Winchester, and the silent strength of those who came before. They remind us through the mist of time that even in darkness, people dreamed of something better. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring gift of all: the knowledge that in every age, even the most uncertain, ordinary people can shape an extraordinary future.